Chapter 1. Crossing Paths. The distinctive clip-clop of horseshoes against packed dirt announced Bradley Morgan's return to Redstone Ridge. Spring dust swirled around his stallion's hooves as he guided the powerful black beast down Main Street, tipping his hat to those townsfolk brave enough to meet his gaze. 3 days in Denver had yielded the contracts he needed, but had done little to ease the tightness in his shoulders. He reined in his horse before McAllister's general store, swinging down with practiced ease despite his trail-worn body. After looping the reins around the hitching post, he removed his gloves, slapping them against his thigh to dislodge the dust of the trail. "Bradley?" The soft voice stopped him cold, his hand frozen on the store's doorknob. He didn't need to turn to recognize its owner. Some voices carved themselves into a man's memory whether he wanted them there or not. "Eleanor," he said, squaring his shoulders before facing her. She stood beneath the striped awning of the millinery shop next door, a vision in pale blue that made her eyes shine like summer skies. Those same eyes had once promised him forever. "I didn't know you were back in town," she said, her gloved hands clutching a small paper-wrapped package. "Just returned from Denver." Bradley kept his voice neutral, fighting the urge to loosen his collar. "Business?" Eleanor stepped closer, the scent of lilac water stirring unwelcome memories. "You look well. As do you." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those devastating eyes. "How have you been, Bradley? I mean, since you gave me back my ring?" The words escaped before he could temper them, sharper than he'd intended. Eleanor flinched. "Forgive me," Bradley said quickly. "That was unkind." She recovered with a small, sad smile. Some would say justified. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and old hurts. 3 years hadn't been enough to make this easy. "I've been well," he finally said. "The mine is producing beyond expectations. Yes, I read about that in the territorial paper. Your new processing method has caused quite a stir." Bradley nodded, wondering if her husband, the Boston banker who'd swept her away, read the same papers. He'd never asked if she'd married the man, though town gossip had filled in those blanks well enough. "And you?" he managed. "Are you merely visiting, or—" "I live in Denver now," she interrupted softly. "Richard's bank opened a branch there last autumn." Richard. The name had a face now, and Bradley hated that it mattered. "I'm just here visiting my aunt for a fortnight," she continued. "She's been poorly." Bradley shifted his weight, nodding toward the package in her hands. "I won't keep you from your errands, then. Are you saying someone now?" The question burst from her so suddenly that Bradley nearly laughed at the impropriety of it. "Mr. Morgan! Mr. Morgan!" A gangly youth in a Western Union cap came running up the street, waving a yellow envelope. "Telegram for you, sir. Just came in." Bradley had never been so grateful for an interruption in his life. He turned from Eleanor with a curt nod. "If you'll excuse me." "Of course," she murmured. "It was good to see you, Bradley." He managed a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good day, Eleanor." Bradley took the telegram, pressing a coin into the boy's waiting palm before the youth scurried away. He unfolded the paper, scanning its contents as Eleanor disappeared into the millinery shop. His jaw tightened with each word he read. Arriving, Redstone Ridge, stop, Easter holiday, stop, confirm preparations, Equidly, stop, Martha. Bradley crumpled the telegram in his fist. 3 years of blessed silence from his sisters, shattered by a terse demand disguised as a family visit. Martha wouldn't be deterred, she never was, but the timing couldn't be worse with the new refining process barely established and investors growing skittish. He pushed through the door of the telegraph office, the bell jingling accusingly above his head. "Mr. Pullman," he called to the operator, "I need to send an immediate reply." The thin man behind the counter smiled nervously. "Of course, Mr. Morgan, right away." Bradley dictated his response through clenched teeth. Clearly stated business demands attention, stop timing impossible, stop reconsider visit stop. Bradley. The operator's pencil scratched rapidly across the paper. "Shall I send it now, sir?" "Immediately." While waiting for the reply, Bradley paced the small office, his spurs jingling with each agitated step. Eleanor's unexpected appearance had rattled him more than he cared to admit, and now Martha's impending arrival threatened what little peace he'd managed to carve out for himself. The telegraph machine clattered to life barely 15 minutes later. Mr. Pullman decoded the message with impressive speed, his expression growing more uncomfortable with each word. "Sir," he said hesitantly, sliding the paper across the counter. Bradley snatched it up, reading his sister's reply with a growing sense of doom. "Flights booked. Stop your turn to host. Stop arriving. Saturday. Stop grow up. Stop." Martha, a muscle jumped in Bradley's jaw as he stuffed the telegram into his pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Pullman." "Will there be a reply, sir?" "No." What was the point? Once Martha made up her mind, changing it would require an act of Congress, and even then she'd likely find a way around it. Bradley stalked out of the office and down the street toward the imposing brick building that housed the headquarters of Morgan Silver Mining Company. He climbed the steps 2 at a time, nodding curtly to his secretary as he passed her desk. "Mr. Morgan, you have several messages." "Not now, Miss Winters." He closed his office door with more force than necessary, dropping into the leather chair behind his desk. The past and present were conspiring against him today. Eleanor's haunting blue eyes and Martha's immovable will. Both women had carved pieces from him in their own ways. Bradley pulled out the telegram again, smoothing the wrinkles with his thumb. 3 years since he'd seen either of his sisters. 3 years of building something that was entirely his own, free from Martha's meddling and Josephine's pleading eyes. And now they were coming here, to his sanctuary. He reached for the crystal decanter on his desk, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a tumbler. The amber liquid burned a familiar path down his throat as he stared out the window at the mountains beyond town, mountains that concealed the silver veins that had made his fortune and given him purpose after Eleanor had shattered his heart. Those same mountains had failed to keep the world at bay. First Eleanor, now Martha and Josephine. Bradley drained his glass, steeling himself for the storm that was surely coming. He'd survived worse. He'd survived this too. But Lord help whoever got in his way until Easter was over. Kendra Tompkins shook the last of the flour into her mixing bowl, her hands moving with practiced grace despite the worry tightening her chest. She'd been stretching supplies for 3 days now, making do with less while charging the same prices. Her customers never complained. Most folks in Redstone Ridge were struggling these days, but the hollow feeling in her stomach had nothing to do with hunger. "That's the last of it," she murmured to herself, kneading the dough for the few meat pies she could still offer today. The bell above the door jangled, and Kendra looked up to see her brother Daniel ducking beneath the doorframe. At 24, he stood a head taller than most men in town, his shoulders broad from working the silver mines before a cave-in 2 years ago had left him with a permanent limp. "Smells good in here as always," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he surveyed the nearly empty display case. Kendra wiped her hands on her flour-dusted apron. "Don't you have fence posts to mend over at the Peterson place?" "Finished early." Daniel moved behind the counter, helping himself to a cup of coffee from the pot warming on the small stove. "Thought I'd check on my favorite sister before heading to town for supplies." "I'm your only sister," Kendra reminded him, unable to suppress a smile despite her troubles. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her work. "Came by the mercantile this morning. Flour's up another 5 cents a pound." Kendra's hand stilled. "Again?" He nodded grimly. "Mr. Peterson says without rain soon we'll be paying double by summer." He took a sip of coffee, his eyes serious above the rim. "Everyone's hurting, Kendra. Even the mines cutting back shifts." "Lord knows we've survived worse," she said softly, returning to her kneading with renewed vigor, as if she could pound away the worry. They had survived worse. The influenza that took both their parents within a week of each other, leaving Kendra and Daniel with nothing but a small eatery and mounting debts. Somehow, they'd kept the doors open, serving simple, hearty food to miners and townspeople alike. The whistling kettle wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Pa would have gone up to Morgan himself and demanded fair prices for supplies coming in on his rail lines, Daniel said, a hint of old anger coloring his words. Kendra gave him a warning look. Pa also had a temper that did him no favors. Besides, Bradley Morgan doesn't set freight prices. No, but his father did, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. "You don't know that," Kendra said more sharply than she intended. Before Daniel could respond, the bell jangled again. Heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Otto Schilling, the German immigrant who owned half the buildings on the east side of town, including the one housing the Whistling Kettle. "Good day, Miss Tompkins." Mr. Tompkins. His accent had softened over 20 years in Colorado territory, but was still thick around the edges. Kendra forced a smile. "Mr. Schilling, coffee?" "No, thank you." He remained by the door, hat in hands. Never a good sign. "I must speak with you about the rent." Daniel straightened, setting down his cup. "We paid for March." Yes, but now is April," and he shifted uncomfortably. "I have received offer for this building. Very good offer." Kendra's heart sank. "You're selling?" "Not yet decided, but must consider." Otto pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "I give notice now. If not paid in full by Easter Monday, must ask you to vacate." The envelope felt as heavy as lead in Kendra's flour-dusted hands. "But that's barely 2 weeks." Otto had the grace to look apologetic. "Business is business, Miss Tompkins. Your father would understand." But her father wasn't here. Neither was her mother, who would have invited Otto to sit, poured him coffee despite his refusal, and somehow convinced him to extend the deadline. "We'll have your money," Daniel said firmly, ignoring Kendra's warning glance. After Otto left, Kendra slumped against the counter. "Don't make promises we can't keep, Daniel." "Who says we can't keep it?" He reached for the envelope, scanning the amount due. His low whistle confirmed her fears. "That's nearly double last month's." "He's pushing us out." "Then we push back." Daniel's jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded her so much of their father. "There's talk up at the mine that Morgan's cook is heading back east, family emergency or some such." Kendra frowned, not following his train of thought. "What does that have to do with us?" "They'll need a replacement. Someone who knows their way around a kitchen." He gestured to the humble surroundings. "Someone like you." "Me? Work for Bradley Morgan?" The very idea was preposterous. "I've never cooked for anyone but miners and townspeople." "You've been cooking since you were tall enough to reach the stove," Daniel insisted. "Ma taught you everything she knew, and she cooked for the governor once." "At a campaign dinner with 50 other women," Kendra corrected. Daniel waved away her objection. "Details. The point is Morgan pays well. A month in his kitchen would cover 6 months' rent here." Kendra looked around at the eatery her parents had built with their own hands. The worn but polished counter, the faded curtains her mother had sewn, the mismatched chairs that somehow made the place feel homey rather than poor. "I can't just abandon the Whistling Kettle." "Not abandon, just temporarily close while you save it." Daniel's expression softened. "What other choice do we have, Ken? Without rain, without customers who can afford more than coffee?" The truth of his words settled like dust after a stampede. What choice did she have? "I wouldn't even know how to apply for such a position." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. "As it happens, I already asked around. They're taking applications tomorrow." Bradley Morgan's stallion picked its way up the winding road that led to his home, perched like an eagle's nest on the hillside overlooking Redstone Ridge. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the white limestone exterior of the mansion with hues of amber and gold. 3 years ago, when he'd commissioned the house, townsfolk had whispered about Morgan pride and wasted money. Bradley had ignored them, as he ignored most town gossip. Let them talk. The house, with its commanding view of both town and mountains, served its purpose, keeping the world at arm's length while reminding everyone below exactly who controlled the lifeblood of their economy. The stable boy rushed forward as Bradley dismounted, taking the reins with a respectful nod. "Welcome home, Mr. Morgan." Bradley handed over his saddlebags. "See that he's properly cooled down, Jacob. He's had a hard ride." "Yes, sir." The front door opened before Bradley reached it, his butler appearing with the uncanny timing of a man who had spent 30 years in service to wealthy families. "Good evening, sir. I trust your journey was successful." "As well as could be expected, Harrison." Bradley handed over his hat and gloves. "Has there been any word from Denver?" "No, sir, but Mr. Clark from the bank stopped by. He left his card." Bradley suppressed a sigh. More concerns about the new refining process, no doubt. Anything else? Cook asked to speak with you upon your return. Most urgent, he said. That was unusual. Abel rarely sought him out, preferring to communicate through Harrison or the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters. Where is he? In the kitchen, sir. Bradley made his way through the cavernous house, his footsteps echoing on the imported marble. His father would have considered such European extravagance wasteful, but Jonathan Morgan hadn't lived to see the fortune his silver mine eventually yielded. He'd died believing his investment would bankrupt the family, leaving Bradley to prove him wrong. The kitchen stood apart from the formal areas of the house, a practical, well-equipped space where Abel had reigned supreme for 2 years. Bradley found him anxiously pacing the gleaming floor, his usually immaculate white coat showing signs of nervous handling. Harrison said you needed to speak with me. Abel startled, then removed his tall chef's hat. Mr. Morgan, yes. Thank you for coming down. Bradley raised an eyebrow at the formality. What's the matter, Abel? It's my wife, sir. She's taken quite ill back in Chicago. The doctor's telegram came yesterday. Abel twisted the hat in his hands. She's with child, you see, and there've been complications. Understanding dawned. You need to return east. Yes, sir, I wouldn't ask, but Bradley held up a hand. Family comes first, Abel. When do you need to leave? Relief flooded the cook's face. The eastbound train departs tomorrow afternoon. Then you should be on it. Bradley meant it, though the timing couldn't be worse with his sisters arriving. Do you have someone in mind to replace you? Temporarily, of course. I thought perhaps one of the cooks from the hotel. Abel hesitated. Though with your sisters coming, you might want someone more refined. News traveled fast in Redstone Ridge, especially news concerning the Morgans. Bradley rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tension that had taken up permanent residence there since receiving Martha's telegram. Place an advertisement. Harrison can screen the applicants. Abel nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir, and I'll make sure everything is prepared for your sister's arrival before I leave. Bradley turned to go, then paused. My sisters will be staying through Easter. Make the advertisement clear that the position is temporary but could become permanent for the right person. Yes, sir. Leaving the kitchen, Bradley climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, his footsteps muffled by the Turkish carpet runner. The house fell silent around him, and only 4 people to rattle around in them. He'd built it thinking of a future with Eleanor, imagining children's laughter in the hallways and a wife's warm welcome at day's end. Instead, he'd created a magnificent mausoleum for his broken dreams. Bradley entered his study, the one room in the house that truly felt like his. Dark walnut paneling, leather-bound books, and a desk large enough to spread out mining schematics gave the space a masculine solidity that comforted him. He crossed to the French doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking the town. Lamps were being lit along Main Street as dusk deepened. From this distance, Redstone Ridge looked almost peaceful. A frontier town that had grown prosperous on the silver pulled from the surrounding mountains. His silver. And soon, his sisters would arrive to remind him of everything he'd left behind in Boston, the society he'd never quite fit into, and the expectations he'd never quite met, the man his father had wanted him to become. Bradley leaned against the doorframe, suddenly bone-weary from more than just the journey from Denver. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe it was time to grow up, to stop hiding on this mountainside, to finally make peace with the past. Or maybe, he thought with grim resolve, it was time to show Martha exactly who he'd become in the years since she'd last seen him. Either way, he'd need a cook who could stand up to Martha's exacting standards. For everyone's sake, he hoped the advertisement yielded better options than the hotel's greasy spoon offerings. But in a town like Redstone Ridge, he wasn't holding his breath. Chapter 2. Desperate Measures. Kendra stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. She'd spent an hour pressing her best dress, a navy blue cotton with only one nearly invisible mend at the seam, and had twisted her chestnut hair into a sensible knot at the nape of her neck. The result was respectable enough, she supposed, but hardly the appearance of someone who had cooked for society's finest. You look like you're attending a funeral, Daniel declared from the doorway of her small bedroom above the eatery. "Perhaps I am," she replied grimly, "the death of my honesty." Daniel sighed, limping into the room to stand beside her. In the mirror, their resemblance was unmistakable. The same determined chin, the same golden flecks in otherwise brown eyes. "It's not dishonesty, Ken. It's strategic omission. Lying, you mean." Kendra turned from the mirror, smoothing her skirts. "Ma would be scandalized." A shadow crossed Daniel's face at the mention of their mother. "Ma would understand doing what needs to be done to survive. Remember when she convinced that cattle buyer she'd been cooking for the military fort? She'd never set foot in Fort Collins in her life." Kendra had forgotten that particular embellishment. "That was different. We were feeding half the county during that blizzard. She did it to help people. And now you're doing it to help us." Daniel picked up the small reticule on her dresser and handed it to her. "Besides, it's not as if you can't cook. You're the best in town, and that's a fact." "The best in a frontier mining town? Not exactly the credentials Mr. Morgan will be looking for." Kendra flipped open the reticule, checking its contents. Application paper, pencil, her mother's small silver locket for good luck. "He'll have his pick of proper cooks from Denver, I'd wager." Daniel perched on the edge of her neatly made bed. "You know your problem, sister? You never see yourself clearly." Kendra glanced back at the mirror, at the worry lines forming between her brows. "I see myself perfectly well." "No, you don't." Daniel's voice softened. "You don't see how Ma's eyes lit up when you mastered her bread recipe at 12 years old. You don't see how Sheriff Taylor still talks about those apple dumplings you made for Founders Day. You don't see how miners walk an extra half-mile past the hotel dining room just to eat your stew." A lump formed in Kendra's throat. "Daniel, you learned more watching Ma cook than most people learn in fancy Eastern cooking schools. So what if it wasn't formal training? Results matter, not how you got them." Kendra sank onto the bed beside her brother, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. "Even if you're right, I can't just waltz in there claiming I cooked for territorial governors and railroad barons. Why not? Half the men in this town claim they struck it rich in California, and the closest most got was panning fool's gold in Cherry Creek." Daniel took her hands in his calloused ones. "This isn't about pride, Ken. It's about keeping a roof over our heads and food on other people's tables." She thought of the eviction notice, now hidden in her dresser drawer, but burned into her memory all the same. 2 weeks. Unless she found the money, in 2 weeks, the Whistling Kettle would be just another failed dream in a town built on broken ones. "I wouldn't even know what to say," she admitted. "What kind of experience do men like Bradley Morgan expect from their kitchen staff?" A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. "As it happens, I asked around. Jenkins up at the hotel says Morgan's last cook claimed to have served in some fancy New York household. All French sauces and such." "French?" Kendra nearly laughed. "I wouldn't know a French sauce if it introduced itself in perfect English, so you'll learn." Daniel's eyes twinkled with mischief. "The hotel has a copy of that fancy cookbook. What's it called? Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management." Kendra had seen it once, a massive tome filled with recipes she could scarcely pronounce, let alone prepare. "That's the one. Jenkins says I can borrow it tonight." The idea was taking shape now, though Kendra still resisted its pull. "Even with the book, I'd be stumbling through half the recipes." "You think Morgan knows the difference between whatever that sauce is called?" "Bechamel," Kendra corrected automatically, remembering the word from a magazine article. Daniel pointed at her triumphantly. "See? You already know more than you think." Kendra rose and moved to the small window overlooking Main Street. From here, she could just make out the roofline of the Morgan mansion on the hillside, its windows catching the afternoon sun like winking gold coins. "Do you remember when Ma taught me to make her special biscuits?" she asked softly. Daniel joined her at the window. "The ones with the honey butter?" Kendra nodded, lost in memory. "I kept asking for the recipe, but she just laughed and said, 'There isn't one, child. You have to feel it in your hands.' She showed me how to know when the dough was just right by touch, not measurement. She was right. Your biscuits are even better than hers now." Kendra turned to face her brother. That's my point, Daniel. What if Mr. Morgan wants fancy written recipes I don't have? What if I'm found out on my first day? I'd be humiliated and we'd be no better off. Or, Daniel countered, what if your cooking is so good he doesn't care where you learned it? What if this is the opportunity that saves the whistling kettle? The eviction notice seemed to burn through the drawer, a ticking clock counting down to their ruin. I suppose I could, she hesitated, then squared her shoulders. I could say I assisted in the governor's kitchen during his visits to Denver. That's almost true. I did help prepare food for the campaign dinner. Daniel grinned. Now you're thinking. And perhaps you studied under your mother, who was known for her skills throughout the territory. That part's true enough. Kendra allowed herself a small smile. And I have fed half the county during blizzards and mining disasters. Exactly. You're just rearranging the facts into a more impressive picture. Daniel checked the mantel clock. The interviews start at 10. If we leave now, you'll be first in line. Kendra took a deep breath, smoothing her dress one final time. The whistling kettle had been her parents' dream, their legacy. If embellishing her credentials would save it, perhaps the sin was forgivable. Very well, she said with newfound resolve. But if Mr. Morgan asks me to prepare escargot or some such nonsense, I'm walking straight out the door. Daniel laughed, relief evident in his eyes. Deal. Though knowing your stubborn nature, you'd probably find a way to make even snails taste like heaven. As they headed downstairs, Kendra sent up a silent prayer for forgiveness and for success. The whistling kettle's bell jingled softly as they left, the sound following her like a gentle reminder of all that was at stake. For better or worse, she was about to become the new cook at the Morgan estate. If only her hands would stop trembling at the thought of meeting the man whose very name could silence a room. The climb to the Morgan estate left Kendra breathless, though whether from exertion or nervousness, she couldn't rightly say. Wrought iron gates marked the entrance to the property, standing open as if daring ordinary folk to venture through. The gravel drive crunched beneath her best boots, polished to a shine that morning but still showing the wear of years. She paused at the bend in the road where the mansion came fully into view. Nothing in Redstone Ridge had prepared her for such grandeur. 3 stories of gleaming white limestone rose against the mountain backdrop, with more windows than she could quickly count. A wide veranda wrapped around the front, supported by columns that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Denver bank. Lord above, she whispered, clutching her reticule tighter. A quartet of women huddled near the servants' entrance, their expressions a mixture of hope and resignation. Competition, Kendra realized with a sinking heart. She approached slowly, nodding a greeting. You here for the cook position too? Asked a plump woman in a faded green dress. Yes, Kendra admitted, trying to appear more confident than she felt. The woman gave her a dismissive once-over. Waste of time, if you ask me. Word is Morgan's already sent to Denver for someone, just going through the motions for appearances. Before Kendra could respond, the servant's door opened and a silver-haired man in somber black appeared. The butler, judging by his impeccable posture and assessing gaze. Ladies, he intoned with the barest hint of a British accent. Mr. Harrison will see applicants one at a time. Please form an orderly queue. The women shuffled into line, Kendra finding herself last, despite Daniel's insistence on arriving early. So much for making a good first impression. The minutes stretched into a half hour, then an hour. One by one, the women entered and exited, their faces telling Kendra all she needed to know about their success or lack thereof. The plump woman in green departed in a huff, muttering about uppity Eastern notions and fancy French foolishness. Finally, only Kendra remained, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The door opened, and the butler appeared again. The master will see you now, miss. The master? Kendra's voice caught. I thought, Mr. Morgan has decided to conduct the final interview himself. This way, please. Heart drumming against her ribs, Kendra followed the butler through a maze of hallways. The kitchen they passed was larger than the entire whistling kettle, with gleaming copper pots and a stove twice the size of her own. Then they were ascending a staircase, moving deeper into the house rather than staying in the servants' quarters. They stopped before a heavy oak door. The butler knocked once, then opened it without waiting for a response. "The last applicant, sir." Kendra stepped into a study that smelled of leather, tobacco, and money. Afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating shelves of leather-bound books and a massive desk where Bradley Morgan sat reviewing papers. He didn't look up immediately. Kendra took the moment to study the man, whose name was whispered with equal parts respect and resentment throughout Redstone Ridge. Younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 or 32, with broad shoulders that his tailored jacket couldn't quite tame. His dark hair was shorter than most men wore it, revealing a strong jawline currently set in concentration. "Name?" he asked without looking up, his pen continuing to scratch across the document before him. "Kendra Tompkins, sir." That got his attention. He looked up, dark eyes scanning her with the same assessing gaze one might give a horse at auction. "Tompkins? Any relation to Joseph Tompkins?" Her father's name in his mouth startled her. "My father, sir." Something unreadable flickered across Bradley Morgan's face. "I was sorry to hear of his passing. He was a forthright man." That was a charitable description of her father's blunt manner, especially regarding the Morgan mining interests. Kendra inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, sir." Morgan set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Harrison tells me the other applicants were unsuitable. I wouldn't know, sir." "No, I suppose you wouldn't." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit." Kendra perched on the edge of the chair, arranging her skirts with hands that refused to be still. Up close, Morgan was even more intimidating, not just in his obvious wealth, but in the quiet authority he carried like a second skin. "You have cooking experience?" he asked, reaching for what she assumed was her hastily completed application. "Yes, sir. I've been cooking since I was a girl." "Professionally?" The moment of truth. Kendra thought of the whistling kettle's empty flour bins, of Otto Schilling's eviction notice. "Yes, sir. Most recently, I assisted in the territorial governor's kitchens during his visits to Santa Fe. It wasn't a complete lie, if one considered a campaign dinner 5 years ago and 200 miles away to be recent and assisting." Morgan's eyebrow arched slightly. "New Mexico territory? You're a long way from home." "My brother was injured in a mining accident 2 years ago. I came to Colorado to help care for him." That much at least was honest. "I see." Morgan glanced down at her application again. "And what brought you to Redstone Ridge specifically?" Kendra hesitated. Mentioning the whistling kettle might expose her embellishments, but lying outright about her current circumstances seemed a bridge too far. "Family connections, sir. After our parents passed, we had nowhere else to go." Morgan's expression softened marginally. "My condolences. Losing both parents is difficult." Something in his tone suggested personal understanding, though Kendra knew better than to inquire. Instead, she nodded. "Thank you, sir." Before Morgan could continue, a sharp knock interrupted them. The butler entered without waiting, carrying a telegram on a small silver tray. "Apologies for the intrusion, sir, but Mr. Clark indicated this was urgent." Morgan took the telegram with a frown, his eyes scanning the message quickly. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "Tell Clark I'll see him first thing tomorrow, and have Jacob prepare my horse. I need to inspect the new machinery immediately." "Very good, sir." As Harrison departed, Morgan returned his attention to Kendra, though she could see his mind was already elsewhere. "You understand this position would require living on the premises? My sisters are arriving from Boston for the Easter holiday, and I need someone who can manage a formal household during their stay." "Yes, sir." "The position is temporary?" "Through Easter, possibly longer, depending on when my regular cook returns." Morgan rose, signaling the interview's end. "Can you prepare French cuisine?" Kendra stood quickly, willing her voice not to waver. "My specialties are more regional, sir, but I'm a quick study." She silently thanked Daniel for his planned loan of Mrs. Beaton's cookbook. Morgan seemed to weigh something in his mind, then nodded abruptly. "You're hired, Miss Tompkins. My sisters arrive Saturday on the noon stage. I expect you to begin tomorrow morning to familiarize yourself with the kitchen." Relief washed over Kendra so strongly she nearly swayed on her feet. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't." He moved toward the door, clearly eager to address whatever crisis the telegram had announced. Harrison will discuss the particulars of your employment, wages, quarters, and such. Good day, Miss Tompkins." With that, he was gone, leaving Kendra alone in the study with the distinct feeling she'd just made a pact with either an angel or the devil himself, and she wasn't sure which. "Well," she murmured to the empty room, "Ma always said the Lord works in mysterious ways." Mysterious indeed that Joseph Tompkins's daughter should find herself cooking for Bradley Morgan, the very man her father had once threatened to run out of the territory. If Pa was watching from heaven, she could only imagine his reaction. But the whistling kettle would be saved, and for now, that was all that mattered. The servants' quarters were sparse but clean, with a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a small trunk for personal belongings. Kendra set her carpet bag on the patchwork quilt that covered the bed. The bag's meager contents, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's cookbook, and a small framed photograph of her parents, a stark reminder of how little she possessed. "It's not much, but it's private," said Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, a thin woman with iron gray hair and tired eyes. "The cook usually has better accommodations, but with Abel's things still in those rooms—" "This is fine," Kendra assured her. In truth, the room was larger than her bedchamber above the whistling kettle, though considerably less homey. Mrs. Winters nodded, apparently satisfied with Kendra's response. "Breakfast for the staff is at 5. Mr. Morgan takes his at 7 when he's home, though he's often away on business. When the ladies arrive, they'll expect breakfast served in the morning room at 8:30. Kendra tried not to let her anxiety show. Feeding miners and townspeople was one thing. Serving Eastern ladies who likely expected quail eggs and delicate pastries was quite another. "I'll show you the kitchen now," Mrs. Winters continued, already moving back into the hallway. Kendra followed, mentally mapping each turn, left from her room, down a narrow staircase, through a butler's pantry stocked with more china than she'd ever seen, and finally into the kitchen itself. She stopped in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed. The room was cavernous compared to the whistling kettle's cramped cooking space. Gleaming copper pots hung from a ceiling rack. A massive iron range dominated one wall, and a separate brick oven built into another would make bread baking a dream. Countertops of polished marble stretched the length of the room, and not one but 2 sinks with indoor pumps promised luxury unknown in her previous kitchen. "Abel kept everything in strict order," Mrs. Winters said, running a finger along a spotless shelf. "Mr. Morgan spared no expense when the house was built. Every modern convenience." Kendra approached the range, her fingers hovering over its surface. "It's magnificent." 6 burners and the warming shelf above," Mrs. Winters explained with evident pride. "The pantry is through there, the cold storage beyond it. Abel ordered supplies weekly from Denver, though we get some things locally." As if the mention of supplies triggered a memory, the housekeeper frowned. "I should warn you, with Abel leaving so suddenly, we're running low on certain items. I've made a list." She retrieved a piece of paper from her apron pocket. "You'll need to visit the mercantile today if you're to prepare proper meals." Kendra scanned the list, relieved to see mostly familiar items: flour, sugar, butter, basics she could handle. The request for white truffles gave her a moment's pause, but she'd cross that bridge when she came to it. "I'll go this afternoon," she promised, tucking the list into her pocket. Mrs. Winters checked the clock on the wall. "I must attend to the linens for the guest rooms. The gardens need attention before the ladies arrive. You might speak with Mr. Hollister about vegetables for your menus. He's usually in the kitchen garden this time of day." After the housekeeper departed, Kendra allowed herself a moment to simply absorb her surroundings. Her mother would have wept at the sight of such a kitchen. Pa would have scoffed at the extravagance. And Daniel would remind her that this temporary paradise was built on the backs of miners who worked themselves to the bone for Morgan silver. She pushed the thought aside. She was here to cook, not judge. One by one, Kendra opened cupboards and drawers, familiarizing herself with their contents. She found utensils she couldn't name, specialized tools whose purposes she could only guess at, and spices she'd only read about in Mrs. Beaton's: cinnamon from Ceylon, saffron from Spain, vanilla beans from Mexico. The Morgan kitchen was stocked like an exotic bazaar. A back door led to the kitchen garden, where neat rows of early spring vegetables were beginning to emerge. An elderly man in shirt sleeves and suspenders knelt between rows of what appeared to be asparagus, a basket of freshly cut spears beside him. "Mr. Hollister?" Kendra called, approaching carefully to avoid crushing any plants. The man looked up, squinting against the sunlight. His weathered face creased into a cautious smile. "That's me. You must be the new cook." "Kendra Tompkins." She offered her hand, which he wiped on his trousers before shaking. "Samuel Hollister. Been tending these gardens since before Mr. Morgan built this fancy house." He gestured to the vegetables around them. "Got spring onions, asparagus, and the first of the lettuce ready now. Peas and radishes soon." Kendra felt a rush of gratitude for the familiar produce. "That's wonderful. Mrs. Winters mentioned I should speak with you about planning menus." Hollister nodded, returning to his harvest. Abel always wanted everything just so. French this, Italian that. Barely used half of what I grew. He glanced up at her. "You one of those fancy city cooks, too?" The question held a trap Kendra wasn't eager to fall into. "I believe in using what's fresh and local when possible," she answered diplomatically. "Though Mr. Morgan's sisters might expect some elevated dishes." Hollister snorted. "Elevated. That's one word for it." He tossed another asparagus spear into his basket. "Ms. Martha would find fault with the Almighty's own cooking, if you ask me. Been like that since she was a girl before their parents passed." Kendra filed away this tidbit about the elder Morgan's sister. "You've known the family a long time, then?" "Worked for old Jonathan Morgan when he first struck silver. Watched Bradley grow from a bookish boy to the man he is now." Hollister's voice held a mixture of respect and something like sadness. "Wasn't always so." He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Difficult?" Kendra suggested, recalling Mrs. Winters' warning. Hollister chuckled. "Solitary's the word I'd use. Boy changed after his father died, more so after that Boston girl handed back his ring." He stood, lifting his basket. "Don't mistake quiet for cold, Miss Tompkins. The Morgans feel things deeper than most, even if they don't show it." He offered the basket of asparagus. "Here, make something nice with these." The boy, "Mr. Morgan. He's partial to them, though he'd never say so." Kendra accepted the basket, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you." Hollister nodded toward the house. "Better get back inside before Mrs. Winters comes looking. That woman runs this place tighter than a drum." He paused, lowering his voice. "Word of advice? When the sisters arrive, keep your head down and your ears open. What they say and what they mean aren't always the same thing." With that cryptic warning, he turned back to his garden, leaving Kendra to ponder his words as she returned to the kitchen. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of activity. Kendra inventoried the pantry, planned the evening's meal, roast chicken with Hollister's asparagus seemed safe enough, and made notes for more ambitious dishes once she had time to study Mrs. Beaton's book. By midday, she'd changed into her work clothes, a simple cotton dress covered by a clean apron, and had bread dough rising near the stove. The rhythm of cooking soothed her nerves, and for brief moments she could almost forget the precarious nature of her position. Then she'd spot something like the silver serving dishes stacked in the hutch, or remember Mrs. Winters mentioning the Limoges china that the sisters preferred, and panic would flutter in her chest once more. "One meal at a time," she murmured to herself, her mother's favorite advice when faced with feeding unexpected company. She was so focused on deboning a chicken that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a throat cleared. Startled, she whirled around, knife in hand. Bradley Morgan stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking as surprised by her reaction as she was by his presence. "Mr. Morgan!" Kendra hastily set down the knife. "I didn't hear you come in." He glanced at the knife, then back to her face, one dark eyebrow raised slightly. "Clearly. I didn't mean to startle you, Miss Tompkins." "No, I should have been paying attention." She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly acutely aware of the flour dusting her sleeves and the loose strands of hair that had escaped her bun. Morgan seemed to fill the doorway with his presence, though he made no move to enter the kitchen further. "I see you've settled in." "Yes, sir. Everyone has been most helpful." He nodded, his gaze traveling over the organized chaos of her food preparation. "I'll be dining out this evening. Business in town." Kendra tried to hide her disappointment and relief. One more day to prepare before testing her cooking on the master of the house. "Of course, sir. However, I'll expect breakfast at 7 tomorrow." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. "And I'd like to review your planned menus for my sister's visit before they arrive." "Of course," she repeated, wondering how she'd create menus sophisticated enough to pass his inspection. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Morgan hesitated as if debating whether to say more. Finally, he simply shook his head. "That will be all, Miss Tompkins." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her with those unreadable dark eyes. "My sisters can be particular. Don't let them intimidate you." Before Kendra could respond to this unexpected advice, he was gone, the sound of his boots fading down the hallway. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Particular. From a man like Bradley Morgan? That word likely translated to impossible to please. Kendra returned to her chicken with renewed determination. She might not have cooked for governors or railroad barons, but she'd fed hungry miners who worked 12-hour shifts and expected hearty, flavorful meals for their hard-earned money. If Martha Morgan thought she could intimidate Joseph Tompkins' daughter, she had another thing coming. Now, if only Kendra could remember which fork was for fish and which for meat, she might just survive until Easter. Kendra arranged the roasted chicken on Bradley Morgan's fine china with hands that refused to be steady. She'd risen before dawn, determined that her first proper meal for her employer would be nothing short of perfection. Now, with the dinner hour approaching, she surveyed her work with critical eyes. The bird's skin had crisped to a golden brown, fragrant with rosemary and thyme from Hollister's garden. New potatoes, roasted alongside the chicken, glistened with butter and parsley. Asparagus, steamed just until tender, provided a splash of green against the pristine white plate. "Simple but elegant," she murmured, echoing her mother's philosophy about presenting food to those with discerning tastes. The dining room clock chimed 7, and Kendra's heart skipped. Mr. Morgan had returned from the mine barely an hour ago, giving her little time to adjust her cooking to his schedule. Harrison had informed her, with the barest hint of sympathy, that the master would dine alone in the smaller breakfast room rather than the formal dining hall. "He dislikes rattling around in that cavern by himself," the butler had explained, arranging silver on the damask tablecloth with mathematical precision. Kendra carried the plate to the breakfast room herself, unwilling to trust her first creation to anyone else. Harrison cleared his throat disapprovingly as she reached for the door handle. "I'll serve Mr. Morgan," he stated, more command than offer. "With respect, Mr. Harrison, I'd prefer to present the first meal myself." Kendra met his gaze steadily, channeling her father's stubbornness. "I'll need to see his reaction to adjust future dishes accordingly." The butler's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, the equivalent of open-mouthed shock from anyone else, but he stepped aside. Bradley Morgan sat at the head of the small table, a stack of papers beside his plate and a glass of amber whiskey at his right hand. He looked up as Kendra entered, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by his usual inscrutable expression. "Miss Tompkins, I expected Harrison." "I hope you don't mind, sir. I wanted to serve tonight's meal personally." Kendra set the plate before him with as much grace as she could muster. Roasted chicken with herbs, potatoes, and fresh asparagus. Morgan surveyed the plate, then glanced up at her. "You needn't stand there watching me eat, Miss Tompkins." Heat crept into Kendra's cheeks. "Of course. Forgive me, sir." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "However, since you're here, you might as well tell me about this dish, your influences." It was the closest to an invitation she'd receive. Kendra turned back, clasping her hands before her to keep them from fidgeting. "The chicken is seasoned simply rosemary, thyme, and sage from Mr. Hollister's garden. The technique is one my mother favored, keeping the meat moist while crisping the skin." Morgan nodded, cutting into the chicken with precise movements. He took a bite, his expression giving nothing away as he chewed thoughtfully. "The asparagus is exceptionally fresh," he noted after swallowing. "Mr. Hollister cut it this morning. It barely needed cooking." Morgan took another bite of chicken, followed by a forkful of potatoes. Kendra held her breath, watching for any reaction. "The seasoning is adequate, though I prefer a touch more salt," he said finally, and perhaps a hint of lemon with the asparagus. Not effusive praise, but not condemnation either. Kendra exhaled slowly. I'll remember that for tomorrow, sir. She waited for dismissal, but Morgan surprised her by continuing the conversation. Where did you learn to cook, Miss Tompkins? Specifically, I mean. You mentioned the governor's kitchens, but your style seems more personal. The question veered dangerously close to exposing her embellishments. Kendra chose her words carefully. My mother was my first teacher. She believed good cooking came from understanding ingredients, not just following recipes. A wise woman. Morgan took a sip of whiskey. My own mother held similar views, though her talents lay in music rather than cuisine. The unexpected personal detail caught Kendra off guard. You play an instrument, sir. A ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. Piano, though poorly. My sisters received the lion's share of musical ability in the family. I find that hard to believe, Mr. Morgan. You strike me as a man who excels at whatever he attempts. The words escaped before she could consider their impropriety. Morgan looked up sharply, studying her with those penetrating dark eyes. You've formed quite an opinion in a short time, Miss Tompkins. Kendra lifted her chin slightly. I'm observant, sir. Indeed. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. And what else have your observations revealed? The question felt like a test, though of what, Kendra wasn't certain. That you prefer efficiency to embellishment, that you value competence over flattery, and that despite your wealth, you take your coffee black and strong like a man accustomed to drinking it over campfires. Morgan set down his fork, genuinely surprised. Harrison has been gossiping, it seems. No, sir. The coffee pot this morning had no traces of milk or sugar, yet was nearly empty when I arrived at 5, since the other staff take their coffee with both, and Miss Winters mentioned you were in your study from before dawn. Kendra shrugged slightly. As I said, I observe. A dry cough interrupted whatever Morgan might have said in response. He covered his mouth with a napkin, the cough deepening until his shoulders shook with the effort. Forgive me, he managed, reaching for the whiskey. Sir, if I may, Kendra stepped forward, concern overriding propriety. That cough sounds troublesome. I could prepare something that might help. Morgan waved away her suggestion, taking another sip of whiskey. It's nothing, dust from the mines. All the more reason to treat it properly. Kendra's voice took on the no-nonsense tone she'd used when Daniel tried to hide his pain after the accident. My mother's remedy cleared the lungs of miners who breathed worse than dust all day. Morgan studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her determination against his own stubbornness. Finally, he nodded once. Very well, Miss Tompkins. I'll try your remedy. I'll bring it to your study in 20 minutes, sir. Back in the kitchen, Kendra moved with swift efficiency, gathering the ingredients she needed. Cloves, ginger root, lemon, honey, and a small bundle of eucalyptus leaves she'd spotted drying in Hollister's workroom. Her mother had sworn by the Australian plant, ever since a traveling doctor had introduced it to Colorado's mining communities years ago. She crushed the cloves in a mortar, sliced the ginger paper-thin, and set water to boil. As she worked, her mind returned to the unexpected glimpses of the man behind Bradley Morgan's reserved exterior. His mother had played music. He took his coffee black, small details that humanized the figure so many in Redstone Ridge viewed as little more than an extension of his father's mining empire. 20 minutes later, Kendra knocked softly on the study door, a steaming cup of amber liquid on a small silver tray. Enter, came Morgan's voice, followed by another muffled cough. The study was dimly lit, a single lamp casting pools of golden light across the massive desk where Morgan sat reviewing documents. A fire burned low in the grate, fighting against the evening chill that descended quickly in the mountains, even in spring. Your remedy, sir, Kendra said, placing the tray on the corner of his desk. Morgan eyed the cup suspiciously. What, precisely, am I about to consume? Cloves, ginger, lemon, honey, and eucalyptus. It will burn going down, but that's how you know it's working. He raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Only if you fear healing, sir. The impertinent response slipped out before she could stop it. To her surprise, Morgan laughed. A short, rusty sound, as if the mechanism hadn't been used in some time. You have your father's directness, Miss Tompkins, so I've been told, though I hope with less of his temper. Morgan lifted the cup, inhaling the steam. Joseph Tompkins and I disagreed on many things, but I never questioned his honesty. He said what he meant, consequences be damned. A trait that didn't always serve him well in business, Kendra acknowledged. Perhaps, but it made him trustworthy, if difficult. Morgan took a cautious sip of the tea, his eyes widening at the intensity of the flavor. Good Lord, you weren't exaggerating about the burn. Drink it all, sir. The effect isn't the same otherwise. Morgan complied, grimacing slightly as he drained the cup. Tastes like liquid fire. The eucalyptus opens the lungs, Kendra explained. The honey soothes, and the ginger and cloves fight whatever's causing the irritation. You sound like you've dispensed this concoction often. In a mining town, lung complaints are common. My mother treated half the county at one time or another. Morgan set down the empty cup, studying her with newfound interest. She taught you more than cooking, it seems. She believed useful knowledge shouldn't be hoarded. Kendra hesitated, then added, There's enough for another cup before bed if you'd like. I would, thank you, Miss Tompkins. The words were simple, but delivered with unexpected sincerity. An awkward silence descended, neither quite knowing how to navigate this temporary truce between employer and employee, man and woman, Morgan and Tompkins. Will there be anything else, sir? Kendra finally asked, reaching for the empty cup. Their fingers brushed as Morgan released the cup into her hand, a fleeting contact that nonetheless sent an unexpected jolt through Kendra's arm. No, that will be all. Morgan's voice sounded strangely rough. Good night, Miss Tompkins. Good night, Mr. Morgan. As Kendra closed the study door behind her, she released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something had shifted between them, subtle as a change in wind direction, but undeniable all the same. She told herself it was merely satisfaction at having completed her first day successfully. Yet as she prepared the second cup of medicinal tea before retiring to her room, Kendra couldn't quite dismiss the memory of Bradley Morgan's laugh. Brief and rusty, but genuine, or the warmth in his dark eyes when he'd thanked her. Dangerous thoughts for a woman in her position. She was here to earn money to save the whistling kettle, not to develop attachments, especially not to a man who believed her to be something she wasn't. Still, as she placed the covered cup outside his study door before heading to the servants' quarters, Kendra allowed herself a small smile. Bradley Morgan might be wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to keeping the world at a distance, but he was still human enough to appreciate a remedy for a troublesome cough. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Chapter 3. Family Tensions. Bradley Morgan stood rigidly at the edge of Redstone Ridge's main street, pocket watch in hand, as the afternoon stagecoach appeared in a cloud of dust. His collar seemed to tighten of its own accord as the vehicle rattled closer, its team of 6 horses straining against their harnesses on the final stretch of road. 3 years since he'd seen his sisters. 3 years of blessed independence about to end with the opening of a stagecoach door. Beside him, Sheriff Taylor pushed back his hat and whistled low. 4 trunks on top, Morgan. Looks like they're planning to stay a while. Easter holiday only, Bradley replied through clenched teeth. 2 weeks at most. The sheriff chuckled. If you say so. He moved away to help the driver control the gathering crowd, leaving Bradley to face his fate alone. The stagecoach lurched to a halt before the Grand Hotel. Before the driver could set the brake, the door flew open and a young woman in a dove-gray traveling costume nearly tumbled out in her haste. Bradley... Josephine Morgan rushed toward her brother, flinging her arms around his neck with the same impulsiveness she'd shown since childhood. At 22, she retained the fresh-faced eagerness that had always softened Bradley's heart, despite his best intentions. Josephine. He returned her embrace briefly before setting her at arm's length. You look well. And you look positively grim, she chided, adjusting her hat where his chin had knocked it askew. Aren't you even a little pleased to see us? Before Bradley could formulate a diplomatic response, a sharper voice cut through the bustle of disembarking passengers. Do control yourself, Josephine. You're behaving like a schoolgirl rather than a lady. Martha Morgan descended from the stagecoach with the precise dignity of a queen granting audience to commoners. At 30, she was the image of their late mother, from her expertly coiffed chestnut hair to the patrician tilt of her chin. Her traveling dress of deep blue serge bore no trace of the journey's dust, as if dirt itself dared not approach her. "Martha." Bradley removed his hat, a gesture of respect rather than affection. "Welcome to Redstone Ridge." "Bradley." She offered her cheek for the briefest of kisses. "You're looking frontier." He ignored the barb, noting instead the third woman emerging from the stagecoach, a honey-blonde beauty whose assessing gaze made the hair on his neck rise in warning. "You remember Cecilia Winthrop," Martha said, gesturing toward the woman. "Judge Winthrop's daughter. She was kind enough to accompany us on this adventure." Cecilia extended a gloved hand, her smile calculated to display perfect white teeth. "Mr. Morgan, how lovely to see you again after so many years. Boston society has been positively bereft without your presence." Bradley barely suppressed a grimace as he bowed over her hand. "Miss Winthrop, I'm surprised you'd exchange Boston's comforts for our rustic accommodations. Oh, I find the West quite thrilling," she replied, her voice dropping to a near purr. "So raw and untamed?" Josephine rolled her eyes behind Cecilia's back, confirming Bradley's suspicion that Martha had brought her friend for matchmaking purposes. "Where are your servants?" Martha interrupted, glancing around the dusty street with evident dismay. "Surely you didn't expect us to arrange our own transportation to your home." "My man is securing your luggage." Bradley nodded toward a wagon where Harrison supervised the loading of trunks. "The carriage awaits around the corner, away from the crowd." Martha sniffed. How considerate. As they made their way through town, Bradley endured a barrage of barely veiled criticisms about Redstone Ridge's muddy streets, the lack of proper shops, and the common appearance of its citizens. Josephine attempted to point out the beauty of the surrounding mountains, only to be hushed by her elder sister's reminder that gushing was unladylike. "You've done well for yourself, Bradley," Cecilia offered, her hand resting longer than necessary on his arm as he helped her into the carriage. "I understand your mine is quite profitable." "The Morgan Silver Mining Company supports most families in this region, directly or indirectly," he replied, deliberately emphasizing the business rather than his personal success. Martha settled her skirts with a sharp tug. "Yes, Father's investment finally yielded returns, though I understand the new refining process has raised some concerns among your investors." The barb struck deeper than Bradley cared to admit. Word of the investors' unease had apparently reached even Boston drawing rooms. "The new process will increase yield by 30%, he said evenly. Change always makes cautious men nervous. Or perhaps prudent men recognize folly, Martha countered. "Oh, look at those darling children," Josephine interrupted, pointing toward a group of miners' offspring playing beside the creek. "Isn't this a wonderful place for families, Martha? So much fresh air and freedom." Her attempt at diversion worked, shifting Martha's attention to a lack of proper educational facilities in front. Bradley caught Josephine's eye, his slight nod conveying gratitude for the interference. Some things hadn't changed. Martha's cutting remarks, Josephine's peacemaking, his own simmering resentment. As the carriage climbed the winding road to his home, Bradley silently rehearsed the promise he'd made himself that morning. 2 weeks. He could endure anything for 2 weeks, even Martha's disapproval and Cecilia's transparent pursuit. "Good heavens, Bradley!" Josephine gasped as the house came into view. "It's magnificent!" Even Martha appeared momentarily silenced by the limestone mansion gleaming in the afternoon sun. Cecilia's eyes widened, her calculation almost visibly adjusting upward. "You've recreated a bit of Boston in the wilderness," Martha finally said, managing to make the observation sound like an accusation. Bradley helped the ladies from the carriage, bracing himself for the next wave of critique once they entered his home. Harrison and Mrs. Winters had arranged everything according to his instructions, but Martha would inevitably find fault. His one consolation as he ushered his sisters and their companion through the front door was the knowledge that dinner, at least, would be beyond reproach. Miss Tompkins had proven herself surprisingly capable over the past 2 days, and the medicinal tea she'd prepared had indeed cleared his troublesome cough. Little did he know that not even Kendra Tompkins's cooking would escape the storm of his sister's arrival. Kendra wiped perspiration from her brow as she surveyed the dining room table. For 2 days, she'd planned this meal with the care of a general preparing for battle. Mrs. Winters had provided intelligence about the Morgan sisters' preferences, while Hollister had supplied the freshest spring vegetables from his garden. Even Harrison had unbent enough to advise her on wine pairings. The result was a frontier feast fit for Eastern sensibilities. Tender venison roast with juniper berry sauce, spring vegetables in herb butter, fresh baked bread still warm from the oven, and an apple tart that had even Mrs. Winters raising an appreciative eyebrow. "You've outdone yourself, Miss Tompkins," the housekeeper admitted, straightening a piece of silver that was already perfectly aligned. "Though, I must warn you, Miss Martha has been known to reduce cooks to tears with a single raised eyebrow. I've served miners who threw plates at the wall when their steaks were overcooked." Kendra replied with more confidence than she felt. "I doubt Miss Martha could be more frightening than that." Mrs. Winters' thin lips twitched in what might almost have been a smile. "We shall see." The dining room door swung open and Harrison appeared. "They're coming down now," he murmured, his expression grave. "Miss Martha has already commented on the lack of fresh flowers." Kendra's heart sank. She'd wanted to place roses on the table, but none were blooming yet in Hollister's garden, and the town's mercantile had been sold out of hothouse blooms. "Perhaps we could," she began, but fell silent as voices approached. "Really, Bradley, I don't understand why you insist on formality when it's just family," came a woman's voice, cultured and cool as mountain spring water. "Martha prefers we dress for dinner, Josephine, you know that." Bradley Morgan's deep voice sent an unexpected flutter through Kendra's stomach. She'd seen little of him in the past 2 days, as he'd been occupied with mine business. Their brief interactions had been cordial but distant, though she'd noticed he'd taken to keeping a tin of her medicinal tea in his study. "I think it's perfectly appropriate," added a third female voice, honeyed and deliberate. "After all, we should celebrate our reunion properly." Kendra and Mrs. Winters withdrew to the kitchen as Harrison opened the dining room doors. Through the serving hatch, Kendra could observe the Morgan family as they entered. Bradley in formal evening attire that emphasized his broad shoulders. A petite young woman with his same dark hair but a much sunnier countenance. A taller, elegant brunette whose bearing screamed old money. And a curvaceous blonde whose hand seemed permanently attached to Bradley's arm. "Venison?" The elegant brunette, Martha, Kendra presumed, sniffed the air with evident displeasure. "How rustic." "The hunting is excellent in these mountains," Bradley replied, seating her at the table. "You'll find the quality rivals anything in Boston." "I'm sure it's wonderful," the younger sister Josephine said quickly. "Everything smells divine." The blonde, presumably the Miss Winthrop Mrs. Winters had mentioned, arranged herself in the chair Bradley held for her, managing to brush against him in the process. "I confess, I was expecting something more refined for our first dinner. Perhaps a nice sole or oysters?" Kendra's cheeks burned at the criticism. She'd considered fish, but the spring run hadn't yet reached the mountain streams, and preserved oysters were a risky proposition at best. "You'll find Miss Tompkins's cooking emphasizes fresh, local ingredients," Bradley said as he took his seat at the head of the table. "A welcome change from the overdressed dishes currently fashionable in eastern cities." The unexpected defense startled Kendra as much as it clearly surprised his sisters. Martha's eyebrows rose fractionally as Harrison began serving the first course. "Miss Tompkins?" Martha repeated, tasting the name as if assessing its vintage. "Not Abel?" "Abel was called back east," Bradley explained, accepting a portion of venison. "Family emergency." "How fortunate you found a replacement so quickly," Cecilia murmured, her fork hovering over her plate, "though it seems she's more accustomed to cooking for lumberjacks than ladies." Kendra's hands clenched in the folds of her apron. Lumberjacks indeed. Her venison roast had once earned praise from the territorial senator himself, not that she could reveal that without exposing her embellished credentials. "I find Miss Tompkins' cooking far superior to the fussy concoctions served at Boston dinner parties," Bradley stated flatly, cutting into his meat. Substance over show, you might say. Martha took a delicate bite, her expression carefully neutral. It's adequate, though the sauce lacks complexity. I think it's delicious, Josephine declared, helping herself to more vegetables. Bradley, these spring onions are so tender. Does your cook grow them herself? Mr. Hollister maintains the kitchen gardens, Bradley replied, though Miss Tompkins works closely with him on what's planted. Another unexpected compliment, though technically untrue. Kendra had only just begun discussing future plantings with the gardener yesterday. Tell me about your new processing method, Bradley, Martha said, deftly changing the subject. Henry Winchester wrote that it's causing quite a stir in mining circles. Bradley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The new method reduces waste and increases yield. The technical details would hardly interest you, Martha. On the contrary, I find business fascinating, particularly when it involves significant family investments. The mine has been profitable for years, Bradley countered. Your family investment has been repaid tenfold. Only after Father's death, Martha noted, her voice sharp as a newly forged blade. He never saw the success he sacrificed everything for. A tense silence fell over the table. Josephine glanced anxiously between her siblings, while Cecilia observed the exchange with poorly disguised interest. Perhaps we could discuss more pleasant matters, Josephine suggested brightly. Bradley, I notice the town is preparing for Easter celebrations. Will there be a social or dance we might attend? Bradley seemed to make a conscious effort to relax his shoulders. There's the annual Easter ball at the town hall. Nothing as grand as you're accustomed to, but the community makes an effort. How charming, Cecilia purred. I do so love rustic gatherings. Bradley, you must promise to dance with me. You'll find Redstone Ridge society less formal than Boston's, he replied, neatly avoiding the commitment. Though I'm sure you'll have no shortage of partners. Harrison appeared with the apple tart, providing another welcome diversion. Kendra held her breath as the dessert was served, knowing that sweets often revealed an Eastern palate faster than savory dishes. This is remarkable, Josephine exclaimed after her first bite. Bradley, your cook is a treasure. Indeed, he agreed, meeting his youngest sister's enthusiasm with a rare smile. Miss Tompkins has a gift for balancing flavors. Cecilia sampled the tart with obvious reluctance, then set down her fork. A bit heavy for my taste. In Boston, desserts are served as delicate confections, not hearty slabs. Perhaps you should have remained in Boston, then, Bradley suggested coolly. Martha shot him a warning look. Cecilia is our guest, Bradley. She merely observes the differences in regional tastes. Of course, he conceded, though his expression remained unyielding. However, while in Redstone Ridge, I suggest embracing local customs rather than comparing them unfavorably to Boston's. You might find unexpected pleasures in simplicity. Kendra wasn't entirely certain, but she thought his gaze flickered toward the kitchen before returning to his sisters. The idea that Bradley Morgan might be including her cooking among those unexpected pleasures sent a ridiculous flush of pride through her chest. Will your cook be preparing our Easter dinner as well? Martha inquired, her tone making it clear she hoped the answer was no. Ms. Tompkins will oversee all meals during your stay, Bradley confirmed. I have complete confidence in her abilities. As do I, Josephine added quickly. This was lovely. Martha's lips thinned, but she said nothing further about the food. The conversation turned to news from Boston, with occasional barbed references to Bradley's absence from society events. In the kitchen, Kendra released a long breath. That could have gone worse, she murmured to Mrs. Winters, who was supervising the cleaning of serving dishes. Don't celebrate yet, the housekeeper warned. That was merely the opening salvo. Ms. Martha is just warming up. Kendra nodded, sobered by the reminder. The venison hadn't been rejected outright, but neither had it impressed. Tomorrow's breakfast would need to be perfect. Perhaps those delicate crepes her mother had learned from a French trapper, with fresh preserves from last summer's berries. As she scrubbed pots with vigor born of determination, Kendra couldn't help replaying Bradley Morgan's defense of her cooking. Substance over show. Coming from a man who lived in a mansion that screamed of wealth and position, the preference seemed incongruous, yet oddly gratifying. Perhaps there was more to Bradley Morgan than Redstone Ridge gossip suggested. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might survive the Morgan sisters' visit with her position and pride intact. Kendra lifted the heavy kettle from the stove, careful not to let it clatter against the iron grate. The kitchen, normally bustling with activity during daylight hours, had settled into a peaceful quiet that she treasured. Midnight had come and gone, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she found comfort in the familiar routine of tea making, her mother's remedy for a troubled mind. The soft creak of floorboards in the hallway alerted her to another's presence. She turned, expecting to find Mrs. Winters on one of her nocturnal inspections. Instead, Bradley Morgan stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dimly lit corridor. "Mr. Morgan!" Kendra nearly dropped the kettle in surprise. "I didn't expect anyone to be awake at this hour." He wore no coat, his white shirt open at the collar and sleeves rolled to expose forearms corded with muscle. Without his usual formal attire, he seemed younger, more approachable, and decidedly more dangerous to her peace of mind. "Nor did I," he replied, stepping into the kitchen. "Though I might say the same of you, Miss Tompkins." Kendra set the kettle on a trivet, smoothing her apron with suddenly nervous hands. "I was just making tea. Would you care for some?" Bradley hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I find myself unable to sleep when the house is so—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Full?" Kendra suggested. A corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. "Precisely. After 3 years of quiet, the sudden influx of opinion is rather overwhelming." The unexpected candor surprised her. Since his sister's arrival 2 days prior, Bradley had maintained a stoic demeanor, revealing little of his thoughts even when Martha's barbs struck deepest. "Family has a way of stirring things we'd rather leave settled," Kendra observed, reaching for 2 cups from the shelf. Bradley approached the large wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen, absently running his fingers along its scarred surface. "My father commissioned this table when the house was built. Said a proper kitchen needed wood that had weathered as many seasons as the cook had recipes." Kendra smiled at the homespun wisdom, so at odds with the opulence of the rest of the house. "Your father sounds like a practical man." Jonathan Morgan was many things, but practical might be the last word most would choose. Bradley pulled out a chair and sat, his posture relaxed for the first time since Kendra had met him. He was a dreamer, a gambler, a man convinced that these mountains held the key to a fortune when others saw only wilderness. And he was right. Kendra placed a steaming cup before him, the fragrance of chamomile and mint rising between them. Eventually, Bradley wrapped his hands around the cup, staring into its depths as if reading tea leaves. Though he didn't live to see the mine flourish. He died believing he'd failed, that he'd wasted the family fortune on a fool's quest. Kendra sat across from him, warming her own hands on her cup. That must have been difficult, carrying on without him. "I was determined to prove him right, even if too late for him to know it." Bradley's voice held a quiet intensity that resonated in the stillness of the midnight kitchen. "The first promising vein was discovered 3 months after we buried him. By then, creditors were circling like vultures. Yet here you sit in one of the grandest homes in the territory." Bradley's laugh held little humor. A monument to stubbornness, perhaps, or to the fear that without visible success people might remember my father as the madman many called him. The vulnerability in his admission touched something in Kendra. "Success is the sweetest revenge." "So I thought." He took a sip of tea, his dark eyes finding hers over the rim of the cup. "Though I've discovered victory loses its savor when there's no one to share it with." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken history. Kendra hesitated, then offered a truth of her own. "My parents built their business from nothing as well. A small eatery that served honest food to hardworking people. And now you continue their legacy?" Kendra's heart stuttered at the dangerous territory. "My brother and we've struggled since their passing. The drought has made things particularly difficult." Bradley nodded, understanding in his expression. "Hence you're seeking employment here." "Yes." Kendra fixed her gaze on her tea, avoiding his eyes lest he read the half-truths in hers. "Though I'm fortunate compared to many, at least I have skills to support myself. Your cooking is exceptional, Miss Tompkins. despite my sister's claims to the contrary. Kendra smiled, grateful for the shift in conversation. Miss Martha has very definite opinions about what constitutes proper cuisine. Martha has definite opinions about everything. He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its usual neat arrangement. Including who I should marry. The casual mention of marriage sent an unexpected pang through Kendra's chest. Miss Winthrop seems eager for the position. Bradley grimaced. Cecilia's eager for the Morgan fortune, not for the man who controls it. There's a difference. You sound certain of that. I've learned to recognize the distinction. His voice took on a harder edge. My former fiancé taught me that lesson thoroughly. The Boston girl? The words slipped out before Kendra could stop them. At Bradley's sharp look, she added, Mr. Hollister mentioned her briefly. Eleanor? Bradley spoke the name like a curse and a caress simultaneously. We were to be married 3 years ago. The announcement had been made, the church secured, the ring on her finger. Kendra waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. Then, a Boston banker named Richard Harrington showed interest in expanding west. He visited the mine, dined at our table, praised the operation. Bradley's knuckles whitened around his cup. 2 weeks later, Eleanor returned my ring. A month after that, she was Mrs. Harrington. I'm sorry, Kendra said softly. That must have been painful. The humiliation was worse than the heartbreak, in truth. To know that a man with cleaner fingernails and Eastern connections could so easily supplant years of devotion. Bradley's laugh was self-deprecating. Perhaps that's why I built this monstrosity of a house, to prove I was every bit as refined as Richard Harrington. Yet you defend my rustic cooking against Eastern sensibilities. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. A recognition of shared understanding that transcended their different stations. Perhaps I've come to value authenticity over appearance, Bradley said quietly. Substance over show, as I told my sisters. Kendra found herself leaning slightly forward, drawn by the intensity in his gaze. A rare quality in a man of your position, and an unexpected wisdom in a woman of your youth. The compliment, delivered without flattery or condescension, warmed her more than the tea ever could. For a heartbeat, they were not employer and employee, not wealthy mine owner and struggling cook, but simply a man and woman connecting over shared disappointments and unexpected common ground. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1, breaking the spell. Kendra straightened, suddenly aware of how improper this midnight meeting might appear to others. It's late, she said, rising from her chair. You should try to rest. Ms. Martha mentioned plans for riding tomorrow. Bradley stood as well, his height more imposing in the confines of the kitchen. Yes, she's determined to inspect every acre of the property, no doubt cataloging its deficiencies. Perhaps she'll find something to approve of, Kendra suggested, gathering their cups. Perhaps. He didn't sound convinced. Thank you for the tea, Miss Tompkins, and the conversation. You're welcome, Mr. Morgan. He paused at the doorway, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Good night, Kendra. The sound of her given name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the midnight chill. Good night, Bradley, she replied, testing the familiarity. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his features from handsome to devastating. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Kendra to wonder what dangerous territory she had just entered, and whether she possessed the wisdom to find her way back to safer ground. The bell above McAllister's general store jangled as Kendra pushed open the door, her market basket over her arm. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above barrels of flour and sugar. The familiar scents of coffee, tobacco, and leather goods greeted her, a comforting reminder of weekly shopping trips with her mother. Well, as I live and breathe, if it isn't the new cook from Morgan's mansion. Mrs. Petersham's voice carried across the store, drawing the attention of several shoppers. The plump woman abandoned her inspection of calico prints to hurry toward Kendra, eyes bright with curiosity, barely disguised as friendliness. Good morning, Mrs. Petersham, Kendra replied, maintaining a polite smile despite her dismay at being the center of attention. How are you finding life up on the hill? Mrs. Petersham asked, positioning herself to block Kendra's path to the grocery section. I hear those Morgan sisters are quite the handful. "The ladies have been most gracious," Kendra lied smoothly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have quite a list to complete before noon." Of course, of course." Mrs. Petersham moved aside, but followed in Kendra's wake like a determined tugboat. "Though I must say, we were all surprised when Harrison hired Joseph Tompkins's daughter to cook for the Morgans. Your father and old Jonathan Morgan weren't exactly friends, were they?" Kendra selected a package of baking powder with more force than necessary. "That was before my time, Mrs. Petersham." "Not entirely, dear. You must have been, 15 when Jonathan Morgan tried to buy out the water rights. That would have left half the town high and dry. Your father led that delegation of businessmen that stopped him, as I recall." The memory surfaced, despite Kendra's efforts to suppress it. Her father returning home red-faced with anger, pounding the table as he railed against that money-grubbing vulture who cared nothing for the town that supported his mine. "Ancient history," Kendra murmured, moving toward the spice display. "And now his son has those Eastern sisters visiting. They were in here yesterday, you know. That Martha has a tongue that could cut glass." Mrs. Petersham leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. "And that blonde friend of theirs, flouncing about like she already has a claim staked on Bradley Morgan. Poor Eleanor hasn't been gone 3 years and already they're parading replacements before him." "Ms. Winthrop is simply a family friend," Kendra said, surprised by her own defensive tone. Mrs. Petersham's eyebrows rose knowingly. "Is that what they're calling it? Well, I suppose Bradley Morgan needs a proper Eastern wife if he's to be accepted in Boston society again. Though why anyone would choose that stifling city over our mountains is beyond me. Not everyone appreciates the beauty of Redstone Ridge." Kendra selected vanilla extract, mentally adjusting her plans for the evening's dessert. "Especially not those who consider themselves above it," came a familiar voice from behind her. Kendra turned to find her brother Daniel, hat in hand, watching the exchange with evident amusement. His presence provided the perfect escape from Mrs. Petersham's interrogation. "Daniel, I didn't expect to see you here." "Thought I'd check on my sister," he replied, giving Mrs. Petersham a pointed look that finally convinced the woman to retreat toward the dry goods section. "Making sure the Morgans haven't worked you to the bone." Kendra relaxed, grateful for the rescue. "Quite the contrary. The kitchen is a marvel, and the pantry better stocked than the mercantile itself." Daniel followed as she continued her shopping, his limp more pronounced today, a sign the changing weather was aggravating his old injury. "And the family? Are they treating you well?" "Miss Josephine is kind enough. Miss Martha is exacting." "And the great Bradley Morgan himself?" Daniel's tone sharpened. "Is he as high and mighty as his reputation suggests?" Kendra thought of their midnight conversation, of the vulnerability Bradley had shown when speaking of his father and Eleanor. "He's been fair, professional." Daniel studied her face with the insight born of a lifetime's shared experiences. "You sound almost admiring, Ken. Remember who you're working for." "A man who pays his debts and expects honest work in return," she replied, perhaps too quickly. "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing, if that's all it was." Daniel lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "But the Morgans have a way of using people, then discarding them when they're no longer useful. Old Jonathan did it to half the prospectors who helped him find that first silver vein. Word is, Bradley's cut from the same cloth." Kendra busied herself examining a jar of preserved peaches. "People change, Daniel. Sons aren't always their fathers. This sudden defense of Bradley Morgan wouldn't have anything to do with that substantial advance he paid you, would it?" Daniel's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "The man may have silver in his mind, Ken, but that doesn't mean he has it in his heart." "That's unfair. You don't know him." Daniel's eyebrows rose at her vehemence. "Do you?" The question hit uncomfortably close to the truth. What did she really know of Bradley Morgan beyond one midnight conversation and a few days in his employ? Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd glimpsed something genuine beneath his reserved exterior, something that contradicted Redstone Ridge's collective judgment. "I know he defended my cooking when his sisters criticized it," she said finally. "I know he works alongside his miners when there's a problem rather than directing from a distance. And I know he speaks of his father with respect, despite their differences. All admirable qualities, Daniel conceded. But remember why you're there, Ken. To earn enough to save the whistling kettle. Not to... He hesitated. Not to what? Kendra challenged, her cheeks warming despite herself. Not to develop attachments that can only end in disappointment. Daniel's expression softened. I've seen how men like Morgan look at pretty young women who work for them. It never ends well for the woman. Mr. Morgan has been nothing but proper, Kendra insisted, ignoring the memory of Bradley's smile when she'd used his given name. See that it stays that way. Daniel took the heavy basket from her arm, a peace offering. I worry about you up there, alone among strangers. I'm hardly alone. There's a full staff and more visitors than I can properly feed without going mad. Kendra forced a light tone, grateful when Daniel accepted the change of subject. As they approached the counter, whispers from a group of women caught her attention. Bringing that Cecilia woman as if Eleanor never existed, Martha Morgan always was determined to control her brother's life, probably why he fled to this wilderness in the first place. Redstone Ridge fed on gossip like a hungry child, consuming and digesting the private lives of its citizens with insatiable appetite. The Morgans, with their wealth and Eastern connections, provided particularly juicy fare. Don't listen, Daniel murmured, steering her away from the whispering women. Town gossips have nothing better to do than tear down those more fortunate than themselves. The irony of his defending the Morgans after warning her against them wasn't lost on Kendra. Now who's changing their tune? Daniel grinned, caught in his own contradiction. I can dislike the man's business practices while still objecting to idle gossip. Besides, only I'm allowed to criticize your employer. It's a brother's prerogative. As Mr. McAllister tallied her purchases, Kendra found herself wondering what Bradley would make of the town's speculation about his sister's visit and about Cecilia's obvious intentions. Would it amuse him? Anger him? Or was he so accustomed to being the subject of gossip that he no longer noticed or cared? How's the whistling kettle holding up with you away? She asked Daniel, deliberately changing the subject. Closed tight as a miser's purse, he replied. Though Jenkins from the hotel asked if we might reopen for Easter weekend. Seems his cook quit after an argument about pie crust of all things. We can't possibly. I'll be cooking the Morgans' Easter dinner. Kendra frowned, mentally calculating the days until Otto Schilling's deadline. Besides, it would hardly be worth the effort for a single weekend. True enough, I just thought you'd want to know people are missing your cooking. Daniel paid for a small bag of peppermint drops, his one indulgence, then helped load Kendra's purchases into the delivery wagon Bradley had sent. Need a ride back up to the hill? She shook her head. Harrison is arranging for these to be delivered. I have more errands in town. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, a commotion down the street drew their attention. Bradley Morgan rode past on his black stallion, accompanied by his sisters and Cecilia Winthrop. The women wore fashionable riding habits that likely cost more than Kendra earned in 3 months. Martha sat her mount with rigid precision, while Josephine bounced happily in her saddle, pointing out sights to a clearly uncomfortable Cecilia. Bradley, however, rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. He spotted Kendra and Daniel, tipping his hat in acknowledgement before continuing toward the trail that led to the mountainside overlook. Well, well, Daniel murmured. The great man himself deigns to notice the hired help. Stop it, Kendra chided. He was being polite. If you say so. Daniel studied her face once more, his expression turning serious. Just be careful, Ken. Whatever you think you see in Bradley Morgan, remember that when Easter's over, he'll return to his world and you to yours. With a quick kiss to her cheek, Daniel limped away toward the livery where he'd stabled his horse. Kendra watched him go, his warning echoing in her mind despite her attempts to dismiss it. The trouble was, after last night's conversation, the lines between Bradley Morgan's world and hers seemed less clearly drawn than before, and that realization was more dangerous than any gossip Redstone Ridge could generate. With a sigh, Kendra turned toward the dressmaker's shop. If she was to survive the remaining days until Easter, and the Morgan sisters' increasingly critical scrutiny, she would need at least one decent dress that didn't mark her immediately as a servant. Perhaps then she might face Bradley across the breakfast table without feeling quite so keenly the gulf between them. A gulf that, despite Daniel's warning and her own better judgment, she found herself increasingly tempted to cross. Chapter 4. Growing Affections. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Kendra began her day's baking. With the Morgan sisters expecting fresh bread for breakfast, she'd risen well before dawn to stoke the brick oven to proper temperature. Now flour dusted her forearms as she kneaded the fourth batch of dough, working in a rhythm that required little thought, allowing her mind to wander. 3 days had passed since their midnight conversation in the kitchen, and Bradley had maintained a careful distance since then. At meals, he addressed her as Miss Tompkins with formal politeness that gave no hint of their shared confidences. Only occasionally, when Martha's criticism grew particularly pointed, did his gaze meet Kendra's with a flicker of silent understanding. The kitchen door swung open, interrupting her thoughts. Expecting Mrs. Winters with another adjustment to the day's menu, Kendra looked up with a ready smile that froze when Bradley Morgan himself stepped into her domain. "Good morning, Miss Tompkins." He wore riding clothes, buckskin breeches and a white shirt open at the collar, with a leather vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been out in the early morning breeze. "Mr. Morgan." Kendra mentally catalogued the kitchen's state. Dough rising in bowls, flour dusting every surface, her own apron smeared with evidence of her labor. "I didn't expect you so early." "Clearly." A hint of amusement warmed his voice. "I often ride at dawn. The mountains are most peaceful then." "And your sisters?" Kendra couldn't imagine Martha choosing horseback riding over a feather bed at such an hour. "Still abed, thankfully." Bradley approached the work table, studying the mounds of dough with obvious interest. "You've been busy. Your sisters expressed disappointment with yesterday's bread. Too dense, according to Miss Martha. Not enough crust, according to Miss Josephine." Kendra couldn't quite keep the edge from her voice. "I thought I'd try variations to please everyone." Bradley's laugh surprised her. A rich, warm sound she'd heard only once before. "A futile endeavor, I'm afraid. Martha and Josephine have disagreed on bread since they were children. Our mother despaired of ever satisfying both at once." The casual mention of his mother caught Kendra's attention. "Did she bake for your family?" "Not since we could afford servants, no. But she taught the cooks her methods." Bradley traced a finger through the flour, dusting the table, drawing an absent pattern. "She believed a woman should know how to feed her family, even if she never needed to. A practical philosophy. She was a practical woman." Bradley looked up, meeting Kendra's eyes with unexpected directness. "May I?" He gestured toward the mound of dough before her. Startled, Kendra stepped aside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, though I can't imagine why—" Her words died as Bradley rolled up his sleeves, revealing muscled forearms dusted with dark hair, and plunged his hands into the dough with surprising confidence. His fingers worked the mass with strong, sure movements that spoke of experience. "My mother insisted I learn alongside my sisters," he explained, seeming to read her astonishment. "Said a man who understood the work that went into his meal would never take it for granted." Kendra watched, fascinated, as he kneaded with a technique similar to her own. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. A shadow crossed his face. "She died when I was 15, influenza." "I'm sorry." Kendra moved to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as she reclaimed half the dough. "My mother taught me everything I know about cooking. Losing her was like losing my compass." They worked side by side for several minutes, their hands moving in complementary rhythm. The simple task took on an unexpected intimacy, a shared endeavor that required no words, only the occasional brush of elbows or exchange of glances when the dough reached proper consistency. "There," Bradley said finally, patting the rounded mound with flour-covered hands. "That should satisfy even Martha's exacting standards." "We'll see," Kendra replied, unable to suppress a smile. "Your sister seems determined to find fault with my efforts." Bradley's expression sobered. "Martha finds fault with anything that threatens her notion of proper order, including my choice to remain in Redstone Ridge rather than return to Boston. Is that why she brought Miss Winthrop? As an incentive to return east? The question was presumptuous, but Bradley didn't seem offended. Martha believes I need the right wife to complete my rehabilitation as a proper Boston gentleman. His mouth twisted in a wry smile. Preferably one with impeccable connections and a suitably decorative manner. And you disagree? Kendra busied herself covering the dough with a cloth, avoiding his gaze. I find I've developed an appreciation for women of substance rather than show. His voice dropped slightly, the words meant for her alone. Women who can create something nourishing with their own hands, who understand the value of honest work. Heat that had nothing to do with the oven flashed through Kendra's body. She looked up to find Bradley watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. Mr. Morgan? I thought we'd progress to Bradley and Kendra, he murmured, taking a step closer. At least in private. The kitchen door swung open with a decisive thrust. Bradley, Harrison said you'd come this way. I've been looking everywhere for... Martha Morgan halted abruptly, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. Her brother and the cook standing close together at the work table, both with flour-dusted hands and flushed cheeks. What on earth are you doing? Martha's cultured voice dripped disbelief. Bradley straightened, his expression closing like a book snapped shut. Helping Miss Tompkins with breakfast preparations. Did you need something, Martha? Martha's gaze shifted between them, lingering on the flour smudging Bradley's expensive riding clothes. I hardly think it appropriate for you to be kneading dough like a common servant. Mother would disagree, he replied mildly. She believed kitchen skills were valuable for everyone, regardless of station. Mother had many quaint notions that served well in her generation. Martha's dismissive tone made Kendra bristle. Times have changed, Bradley. Men of your position have more important concerns than bread making. Indeed, Bradley wiped his hands deliberately on a nearby towel. Such as the letter that just arrived from Henry Winchester. He and several other investors are expressing serious reservations about your new processing method. Martha withdrew an envelope from her sleeve. He suggests a meeting in Denver next week. Bradley's jaw tightened. My new method works, Martha. The initial results prove it. Results on paper aren't enough to satisfy men who've invested fortunes. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice, though her eyes flicked meaningfully toward Kendra. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. The dismissal was clear. Kendra busied herself with the bread dough, pretending not to listen, though every nerve strained to catch their conversation. Ms. Tompkins has work to do, Bradley said, his tone noticeably cooler. We'll speak in my study. As they turned to leave, Martha paused, her gaze returning to Kendra with calculated assessment. The breakfast bread should be crusty on the outside, soft within. The last batch was sadly lacking in both qualities. Before Kendra could respond, Bradley placed a hand on his sister's elbow, firmly guiding her toward the door. I'm certain Miss Tompkins will take your preferences into account, Martha. At the threshold, he glanced back, meeting Kendra's eyes with a look that conveyed both apology and frustration. Then the siblings were gone, leaving Kendra alone with cooling dough and heated thoughts. She pressed her flour-covered hands against her cheeks, feeling the warmth there. What had just happened? Had Bradley Morgan, owner of the richest silver mine in the territory, Boston-bred gentleman, her employer, been flirting with her over bread dough? Foolishness, she murmured, returning to her work with determined concentration. Whatever had passed between them, Martha's arrival had effectively doused it like cold water on hot coals. The elegant Martha Morgan would never allow her brother to form an attachment to a mere cook, especially not Joseph Tompkins's daughter. Yet, as Kendra shaped the dough Bradley had kneaded, she couldn't help remembering the strength in his hands, the warmth in his eyes when he spoke of women of substance, the electricity in the air during those moments before Martha's interruption. Dangerous thoughts, indeed. But as she slid the loaves into the oven, Kendra found herself hoping against all reason and probability that Bradley might find his way back to her kitchen before the day was done. Bradley Morgan's formal dining room had been transformed into a war room of social planning. Martha presided at the head of the gleaming mahogany table, a leather-bound notebook open before her and a silver pen poised in her slender fingers. Josephine sat to her right, chin propped on her hand as she idly rearranged the colored paper samples spread before her. Cecilia occupied the chair to Martha's left, her golden curls catching the morning light as she leaned forward with exaggerated interest. "The Easter service will be followed by a reception here," Martha declared, making a decisive notation in her book. "Nothing ostentatious, simply an opportunity to remind Redstone Ridge of the Morgan family's standing." "Must we?" Josephine sighed, selecting a pale lavender ribbon from the collection. "The townspeople already know who we are. I'd rather have a simple family dinner." Martha's lips thinned. 3 years in this wilderness has damaged Bradley's position in society. This visit is our opportunity to restore what he's neglected. "I think it's a marvelous idea," Cecilia offered, her voice honey-sweet. "Bradley deserves to reclaim his rightful place. A successful reception would remind everyone that the Morgans aren't merely wealthy miners, but true gentlefolk." "Precisely." Martha's approving nod made it clear whose opinion carried weight in this discussion. "We'll need floral arrangements for the entry hall, dining room, and parlor. Josephine, you'll oversee those." "White lilies are traditional for Easter," Cecilia suggested, "though I've always found them a bit common. Perhaps orchids imported from Denver?" Josephine looked up from her ribbons. "The wildflowers here are beautiful this time of year. Wouldn't native blooms be more appropriate for a Redstone Ridge celebration?" "How charmingly rustic," Cecilia murmured, not quite hiding her disdain, "though hardly suitable for a formal reception." Martha made another note. "Orchids, then, and we'll need new linens. The ones in use are serviceable, but hardly elegant. I noticed Whitcomb's Mercantile carries some acceptable Irish lace. The expense seems unnecessary for a single event," Josephine protested. "Nothing is unnecessary when it comes to Bradley's future," Martha's pen scratched across the paper with meticulous precision. "Which brings me to our most important consideration. Finding Bradley a suitable wife," Cecilia finished, her smile calculated. "A man in his position needs the right partner to advance his interests in both business and society." Kendra froze in the hallway outside the dining room, the silver serving tray in her hand suddenly unbearably heavy. She had intended to clear the remains of the ladies' morning chocolate, but their conversation stopped her as effectively as a physical barrier. "Eleanor's defection was a blessing in disguise," Martha was saying. "She lacked the spine necessary for a Morgan wife. Bradley needs someone who understands his position, who can guide him back to proper society without appearing to do so." "Someone like Cecilia," Josephine said flatly. "I would consider it my most sacred duty to help Bradley achieve his rightful place," Cecilia replied, sincerity dripping from each word like oversweet honey. "His talents are wasted in this backward territory. With the right wife by his side, he could take Boston by storm, perhaps even New York." "Exactly my thought when I suggested you accompany us," Martha approved. "Your father's connections in banking would be invaluable to Bradley's business interests, and your mother's social circle would smooth his re-entry into society." "But does Bradley want to return to Boston?" Josephine's question hung in the air like gunsmoke after a shot. "He seems content here." "Content isn't the same as fulfilled," Martha dismissed. "Men often mistake independence for happiness. Bradley needs gentle guidance toward better choices. And I would be delighted to assist with the Easter preparations," Cecilia added smoothly, redirecting the conversation. "Perhaps I could help oversee the menu? I've attended the finest gatherings in Boston and understand what will impress your guests." Kendra backed away silently, unwilling to hear more. The silver tray trembled in her hands, though whether from anger or some other emotion she couldn't say. The idea of Cecilia dictating changes to her carefully planned Easter menu sent a flash of irritation through her veins. But the larger realization that Martha and Cecilia were actively plotting Bradley's future without his knowledge or consent sparked something deeper and more disturbing. It shouldn't matter to her whom Bradley Morgan married. He was her employer, nothing more. Their moments of connection in the kitchen, their midnight conversation, these were merely kindnesses from a man who, whatever his faults, treated his staff with basic human dignity. Yet the thought of Bradley returning to Boston with Cecilia Winthrop on his arm left a hollow feeling in Kendra's chest that no amount of rational thinking could fill. "You want me to what?" Kendra stared at Bradley in disbelief, certain she had misheard him. "Ride with me," he repeated, his expression serious despite the twinkle in his dark eyes. "My sisters have commandeered the house for their Easter planning, and I find myself desperate for escape. I thought you might welcome the same." They stood in the kitchen garden, where Kendra had been consulting with Hollister about vegetables for the Easter menu. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the freshly turned earth, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark trilled its springtime song. "But I don't ride," Kendra protested, glancing down at her work dress and practical shoes. "And I have dinner preparations to oversee. Mrs. Winters assures me that everything is well in hand. As for riding," Bradley gestured toward the stable where a groom held the reins of 2 saddled horses, his imposing black stallion, and a smaller, gentler-looking chestnut mare. "Daisy there is the sweetest-tempered mount in the territory. She practically rides herself." Kendra hesitated. "Your sisters are occupied with Cecilia selecting appropriate floral arrangements from a Denver catalog." Bradley's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "They won't miss either of us for several hours." The temptation was powerful. After days in the hot kitchen, the idea of fresh mountain air and open spaces called to her like water to a parched traveler. Still, the impropriety of riding alone with her employer. "I don't have riding clothes," she said weakly, her last defense crumbling. "Josephine left some of her older things behind when she moved east. I took the liberty of having Mrs. Winters locate them." Bradley's confidence that she would accept both irritated and flattered her. "They're in the small guest room at the top of the back stairs." Kendra looked into his expectant face and found her resistance melting like spring snow. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Not everything," he admitted with surprising candor. "I haven't figured out how to endure another hour of Martha's matrimonial schemes without committing fratricide. But I'm hoping this ride might restore my patience." The mention of Martha's schemes sent a pang through Kendra's heart, as she recalled the morning's overheard conversation. Before she could reconsider, she nodded. "Give me 15 minutes to change." Josephine's riding habit was a simpler affair than the fashionable costumes the Morgan sisters now wore, but the deep green woolen skirt and matching jacket fit Kendra surprisingly well with only minor adjustments. She twisted her hair into a simple knot, donned the accompanying hat with its jaunty feather, and made her way to the stables where Bradley waited. His appreciative gaze as she approached sent warmth flooding her cheeks. "Green suits you," he said simply. "Thank you for the loan of the clothes," Kendra replied, suddenly shy, "though I still don't know how to ride properly." "That's why I'm teaching you." Bradley led her to the chestnut mare, who regarded them with liquid brown eyes. "Daisy, meet Miss Tompkins. She's new to riding, so you'll need to be on your best behavior." Kendra reached out tentatively to stroke the horse's velvety nose. "She's beautiful and gentle as a lamb." Bradley moved beside her, his hand covering hers as he demonstrated how to offer your palm to a horse. "Let her get to know you first." The warmth of his hand enclosing hers sent a shiver up Kendra's arm that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. Bradley stood close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his shaving soap mingled with leather from his riding gloves. "Now, for mounting," he said, releasing her hand after a moment that stretched slightly too long to be merely instructional. "I'll help you up." Before Kendra could prepare herself, Bradley's hand circled her waist, lifting her easily into the side saddle. The sudden elevation and unfamiliar perch left her momentarily breathless, or perhaps it was the lingering sensation of his strong hands at her waist. "Keep your back straight, shoulders relaxed," he instructed, adjusting her position with gentle touches to her elbow and knee. "The reins should be held like so, not too tight, not too loose." Kendra followed his directions, concentrating fiercely on the technical aspects of horsemanship rather than the disturbing awareness of Bradley Morgan as a man rather than an employer. By the time he mounted his own horse, she had achieved a precarious but passable posture in the saddle. "We'll stay at a walk today," he promised, guiding his stallion alongside Daisy. "Just follow my lead and trust your horse. She knows these trails better than most people." They set off at a gentle pace, Bradley keeping close to monitor Kendra's progress. The initial terror of being atop a living, breathing creature gradually gave way to cautious enjoyment as Daisy proved true to Bradley's description. The mare moved with smooth, even steps, responding to the lightest pressure of the reins. "You're a natural," Bradley observed as they followed a winding trail away from the mansion and into the piney woods that covered the hillside. "Hardly," Kendra laughed, relaxing incrementally as her confidence grew. "But Daisy is as patient as you promised. Some horses, like some people, have a gift for making others comfortable in unfamiliar territory." Bradley's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "You have that gift as well, Miss Tompkins. I've noticed how quickly the staff took to you, despite Abel's long tenure." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. "I've always found kitchens to be much the same wherever you go. It's simply a matter of learning where things are kept and who prefers their coffee strong or weak." "You underestimate yourself." Bradley guided them around a bend in the trail, where it widened enough for them to ride side by side. "Not everyone could step into a kitchen like mine and master it so quickly, especially with my sister's constant, suggestions." "You mean criticism," Kendra corrected with a smile that took the sting from her words. Bradley laughed, the sound echoing among the pines. "I did warn you they could be difficult." "Miss Josephine isn't so bad," Kendra allowed, carefully steering Daisy around a fallen branch. "She at least appreciates good food when it's placed before her." "Josie has always been the kindest of us," Bradley agreed, less concerned with appearance and position than with genuine happiness. "Martha considers it her greatest failing." "And what do you consider it?" "Her greatest strength." Bradley's expression softened. "Josephine sees people for who they are, not what they represent or how they might be useful. It's a rare quality in our circle." The trail opened suddenly onto a small clearing at the edge of a cliff. Bradley dismounted in a fluid motion, then moved to help Kendra from her saddle. His hands at her waist steadied her as her feet touched ground, lingering a moment longer than necessary as she found her balance. "Oh," she gasped as she turned and saw the view. The entire valley spread before them, Redstone Ridge nestled along the river like a toy village, the church spire and larger buildings distinct even at this distance. Beyond, the mountains rose in ever higher ranks, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the afternoon sun. "My thinking place," Bradley said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the cliff's edge. "I found it the first week after my father died, when the mine was failing and creditors were circling. I came here to decide whether to abandon his dream or risk everything to pursue it." Kendra glanced at his profile, strong and certain against the backdrop of sky. "You chose risk." "I chose faith," he corrected gently. "Faith in my father's vision, in the mountain's bounty, in my own ability to succeed where he had failed." Bradley turned to face her, his expression suddenly vulnerable. "I've shared this place with only one other person." "Eleanor?" The name slipped out before Kendra could stop it. "Yes." Something flickered in Bradley's eyes. Not pain, as she might have expected, but a kind of bemused recognition, though she found it rather dull compared to Boston's entertainments. Just trees and rocks, she called it. Kendra looked back at the breathtaking panorama, unable to comprehend such blindness. She couldn't see the beauty. She saw only wilderness, where I saw possibility. Bradley moved closer, his shoulder nearly touching hers. I think perhaps she never understood me at all. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Kendra became acutely aware of Bradley's proximity, of the warmth radiating from his tall frame, of the way the breeze ruffled his dark hair where it escaped his hat. "And do you," he asked softly, "understand me?" Kendra turned to find him watching her, his dark eyes intent, as if her answer mattered more than she could comprehend. "I understand enough to know you're not the cold, calculating businessman this town believes you to be," she said honestly. "Beyond that, I'm still learning." Bradley smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his features from handsome to heart-stopping, "as am I." His gaze dropped to her lips, his intent unmistakable as he leaned slightly forward. Kendra, I... The sound of hoofbeats on the trail behind them broke the moment like glass shattering on stone. Bradley stepped back swiftly, putting a proper distance between them as two riders emerged from the tree line. "There you are!" Josephine called, her face bright with exertion and pleasure as she guided her horse into the clearing. "Martha was about to send a search party." Cecilia Winthrop followed, looking considerably less comfortable on horseback than Josephine despite her fashionable riding habit. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. Bradley and Kendra standing by the cliff's edge, the remains of whatever moment they had shared still hanging in the air between them. "Bradley, darling, you've been hiding from us," Cecilia pouted, making a show of controlling her dancing horse. "Martha needs your input on the guest list for the Easter reception." "You found my secret spot," Bradley replied, his tone light, though Kendra noticed the tension that had returned to his shoulders. "I was just showing Miss Tompkins the view while discussing refreshments for the Easter celebration." "How considerate of you," Cecilia said, her smile not reaching her eyes as they swept over Kendra's borrowed riding habit. "Though surely such matters could be addressed in the kitchen where Miss Tompkins belongs." The deliberate insult hung in the air like gun smoke. Before Kendra could respond, Bradley stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Ms. Tompkins belongs wherever I invite her to be on my property, Cecilia." His voice remained pleasant, but steel underlay each word. "And I would appreciate your remembering that she is a valued member of my household, not a servant to be dismissed." Josephine's eyes widened at her brother's defense, while Cecilia's cheeks flushed an unbecoming red. "Of course, Bradley. I meant no offense." "Splendid." He turned to Kendra, the public mask firmly back in place, though his eyes conveyed a different message entirely. "Shall we return to the house, Miss Tompkins? I believe you mentioned dinner preparations requiring your attention." Kendra nodded, grateful for the graceful exit he provided. "Yes, thank you for showing me the view, Mr. Morgan. It was most educational." As Bradley helped her mount Daisy once more, his hands at her waist conveyed a gentle squeeze that spoke of regret and promise all at once. The almost kiss lingered in Kendra's mind like a melody half-remembered, tantalizing in its incompleteness. The ride back passed in strained conversation, with Josephine chattering about Easter plans and Cecilia watching Kendra with the calculating assessment of a rival. Bradley maintained his position beside Kendra, ostensibly to ensure her safety on her first ride, though the protective stance felt like something more significant. Only when they reached the stables and prepared to part ways did Bradley manage a private word, hanging back as Josephine led Cecilia toward the house. "I apologize for the interruption," he said quietly, his eyes conveying deeper meaning than his words. "And for Cecilia's rudeness." "No apology needed," Kendra replied, equally soft. "It was a lovely ride, and I appreciate the lesson." Bradley's gaze held hers for a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed. "Perhaps we might continue your instruction another day. There are many beautiful views in these mountains worth sharing." The double meaning wasn't lost on Kendra. "I'd like that," she admitted, surprising herself with her boldness, "though your sisters might have other ideas." "My sisters don't dictate my actions, whatever they might believe." Bradley's jaw set in a stubborn line she was coming to recognize. "Nor does Cecilia Winthrop, despite Martha's machinations." Before Kendra could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared at the kitchen door, her pinched expression signaling urgent business requiring attention. The moment of privacy evaporated, leaving only the memory of what might have been at the cliff's edge. As Kendra hurried toward the kitchen, she could feel Bradley's gaze following her, and with it, the unsettling knowledge that something fundamental had shifted between them. Something that neither Martha's disapproval nor Cecilia's scheming could easily dismiss. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck 11 when Bradley heard the soft knock at his study door. He looked up from the mining reports spread across his desk, frowning at the interruption. The household typically retired early, with only Harrison occasionally bringing a final brandy before securing the house for the night. "Enter," he called, setting aside his pen and straightening in his chair. The door opened slowly to reveal Cecilia Winthrop, her golden hair tumbling loose about her shoulders in a cascade of carefully arranged curls. She wore a silk dressing gown in pale blue that matched her eyes, modest enough to claim propriety if discovered, yet revealing enough in its cling to leave little doubt about her intentions. Cecilia. Bradley rose from his chair, his expression carefully neutral. Is something wrong? Nothing at all, she murmured, slipping into the room and closing the door behind her with a soft click. I simply couldn't sleep and saw the light beneath your door. I thought perhaps you might welcome some company. Bradley remained behind his desk, maintaining the barrier between them. It's late. The household will talk if you're discovered here. Celia's laugh was a practiced trill. Let them talk. We're both adults, Bradley, and hardly strangers to one another. She moved toward the sideboard where crystal decanters caught the lamplight. May I? The night air is so chilly in these mountains. Without waiting for permission, she poured herself a small measure of brandy, sipping it with deliberate delicacy. Won't you join me? Bradley watched her calculated movements with growing impatience. What do you want, Cecilia? She turned, feigning surprise at his directness. Why, to spend time with an old friend, of course. Her eyes softened in a look she'd likely practiced before her mirror. We were close once, before Eleanor came between us. That was a long time ago. Bradley kept his voice even. We were hardly more than children. We're not children now. Cecilia set down her glass and glided toward him, her movements fluid and practiced. Martha told me how devastated you were when Eleanor left, how you retreated to this wilderness to nurse your wounded pride. Bradley's jaw tightened. Is that what Martha says? She worries about you, as do I. Cecilia reached his desk, trailing her fingers along its polished surface. You've accomplished remarkable things here, Bradley. The mine, this house. You've proven yourself beyond question. But don't you think it's time to return to civilization, to claim your rightful place in society? My place is here, he said firmly. My business, my home, my future. They're all in red. Cecilia's smile turned knowing. For now, perhaps, but a man of your ambition surely sees beyond these mountains. With the right partner, you could expand your holdings, establish connections in Eastern financial circles, perhaps even in Europe. Her implication hung in the air between them. Bradley studied her face, beautiful by any standard, with its perfect features and calculated expressions. 3 years ago, he might have been flattered by her attention, might even have considered the advantages of such a match. But that was before Eleanor's betrayal had taught him to look beneath surface beauty. Before midnight conversations with a woman whose honesty and quiet strength had awakened something he'd thought long buried. A business partnership, Cecilia? Is that what you're proposing? He deliberately misinterpreted her suggestion. Her smile faltered slightly before recovering. I'm proposing much more than that, Bradley. I'm offering you a complete partnership. Social, financial, and personal. She moved around the desk with deliberate grace, eliminating the barrier between them. We would suit each other perfectly. Your mining enterprises, my father's banking connections. Your rugged good looks, my social graces. She placed a hand on his arm, her fingers applying subtle pressure. Martha agrees it would be an ideal match. Does she? Bradley didn't move away, but neither did he respond to her touch. And have you and Martha discussed this arrangement at length? We want what's best for you, Cecilia murmured, stepping closer until the subtle scent of her expensive perfume surrounded him. I could make you happy, Bradley. I understand the demands of your position, the needs of a man like you. Do you? Bradley finally stepped back, putting distance between them. Then you'd understand that I make my own decisions, regardless of what Martha or anyone else might wish for me. Cecilia's expression hardened momentarily before she recovered. Of course, I admire your independence. It's part of what makes you so desirable. She moved toward him again, undeterred. But surely you must be lonely here, surrounded by rough miners and provincial townspeople. Don't you miss the stimulation of proper society? The company of a woman who understands your background, your position? I find Redstone Ridge provides all the stimulation I require. Bradley's voice cooled. And the people here have a refreshing honesty. that I've come to value above social pretensions. People like your little cook? Cecilia's tone sharpened, her mask slipping to reveal the calculation beneath. I saw how you looked at her today on that ridiculous cliff. Really, Bradley, a serving girl? Martha would be scandalized. Bradley's expression hardened. Miss Tompkins is an employee deserving of respect, not a topic for gossip. I suggest you remember that while you're a guest in my home. An employee with a somewhat flexible relationship with the truth, from what I gather. Cecilia twirled a golden curl around her finger, watching his reaction closely. Did you know your precious cook has been less than forthcoming about her background? Martha had me inquire with acquaintances in Santa Fe. No territorial governor there recalls employing a Miss Tompkins in his kitchen. The unexpected attack on Kendra caught Bradley off guard, though he controlled his expression. Your concern for my household staffing is noted, if misplaced. I'm concerned for you, Bradley. Celia softened her approach, reaching up to touch his cheek with cool fingers. You're too trusting, too generous. People take advantage of that. First Eleanor, now this cook with her fabricated references. You deserve someone who values you for yourself, not what you can provide. The irony of Cecilia, of all people, making such a claim almost made Bradley laugh. Instead, he gently but firmly removed her hand from his face. It's late, Cecilia. I think you should return to your room before someone notices your absence. Her eyes flashed with anger before she masked it with a pout. You're sending me away? When I've made my feelings so clear? Your feelings, or Martha's plans? Bradley moved to the door, opening it pointedly. Either way, this conversation is over. Good night, Cecilia. She gathered her dignity around her like a cloak, lifting her chin as she glided toward the door. You're making a mistake, Bradley. A man in your position can't afford to be distracted by inappropriate attachments. The mine, your investors. There's so much at stake. Bradley held the door wider. I'm well aware of what's at stake. Good night. Cecilia paused in the doorway, her blue eyes cold despite her smile. She's using you, you know, playing on your loneliness, your isolation. When she's gotten what she wants, money, position, whatever it is, she'll disappear like morning mist. Women like that always do. Women like what exactly? Bradley's voice dropped dangerously. Opportunists. Cecilia shrugged one silk-clad shoulder. Ask her about the whistling kettle sometime. See how honest your paragon of frontier virtue really is. Before Bradley could demand an explanation, she slipped away down the darkened hall, the soft rustle of her silk wrapper fading as she disappeared around the corner. Bradley closed the door, his mind racing. The Whistling Kettle. The name was vaguely familiar, a small eatery in town that he'd passed but never entered. What connection could it have to Kendra, and why would Cecilia consider it damaging? He returned to his desk, but the mining reports held no appeal now. His thoughts kept circling back to Kendra, her eyes when she'd seen the view from his cliff top, her capable hands kneading bread dough, her quiet dignity when facing Martha's criticism. Had she embellished her background to secure the position? Perhaps. Many did when seeking employment. But his instincts told him there was more to Kendra Tompkins than a cook seeking a better position. Something in the way she'd spoken of her parents' struggles, in her knowledge of the town and its people, in her fierce pride that surfaced when challenged. Bradley poured himself a measure of brandy, swirling the amber liquid as he considered Cecilia's warning. Whatever connection existed between Kendra and the Whistling Kettle, he had a growing conviction that it would take more than Cecilia's insinuations to shake his trust in the woman who had, somehow, become far more than simply his cook. Tomorrow, he decided, he would visit town. Perhaps a casual inquiry about the Whistling Kettle might yield answers that Kendra herself seemed reluctant to provide, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to understand her, to know the woman who had in such a short time made him question everything he thought he wanted in a partner and a future. Chapter 5. Secrets and Invitations. Kendra balanced a tray of carefully arranged pastries as she approached the morning room where the Morgan sisters took their afternoon tea. Mrs. Winters had been specific about the presentation. Delicate lemon tarts and butter cookies arranged just so, the silver service polished to mirror brightness. Usually Harrison would deliver such refreshments, but the butler had been dispatched to town on an errand, leaving Kendra to navigate the sisters' afternoon ritual. She hesitated outside the partially open door, hearing Martha's voice rise in unusual animation. "You simply don't understand what's at stake, Josephine. Bradley is throwing away everything Father worked for, everything we suffered for." "Bradley is living his own life," came Josephine's calm reply. "The mine is successful beyond Father's wildest dreams. Why can't that be enough for you?" Kendra knew she should announce her presence or retreat, but something in the sisters' tone, the raw emotion so unlike their usual controlled interactions, held her motionless. "Because it isn't just about money." Martha's voice cracked slightly. "It's about position, about belonging. The Morgans were somebody in Boston before Father's obsession with silver dragged us west. Bradley could restore all that if only he'd leave this God-forsaken wilderness. And marry Cecilia Winthrop, I suppose." Josephine's tone sharpened. "Is that why you brought her here, as bait to lure Bradley back east?" A teacup clattered against a saucer. "Cecilia would make him an excellent wife. Her father's connections alone." "Her father's connections!" Josephine interrupted with unusual vehemence. "That's all you care about, isn't it? Not whether she might make Bradley happy, but how useful she'd be to the Morgan ambition." "Happiness is a luxury few can afford, Josephine. I thought David had taught you that much, at least." A heavy silence followed, and Kendra found herself holding her breath. "That was cruel, Martha, even for you." Josephine's voice had gone soft with hurt. Martha sighed audibly. "I apologize. That was uncalled for. You did the same thing with Bradley that you did with me, you know," Josephine said after a moment. "Tried to orchestrate the perfect match without considering the heart involved. At least I escaped before the wedding. Eleanor had more sense than David did." "You think Eleanor left because she didn't love Bradley?" Martha's laugh held no humor. "She left because I convinced her she wasn't good enough for him, that she'd hold him back from his full potential." The admission hung in the air like gunsmoke. Kendra's hands tightened on the tray, the silverware clinking faintly. "You did what?" Josephine's voice had dropped to a horrified whisper. "I offered her money to leave him. She refused. So I convinced her that Bradley would eventually resent her, that she lacked the background and education to be a proper Morgan wife." Martha's voice had gone flat, emotionless. 2 weeks later, she returned his ring. A month after that, she married Richard Harrington. "Does Bradley know?" "Of course not, and he never will." Kendra's heart pounded against her ribs. The casual cruelty of Martha's manipulation left her breathless with anger. No wonder Bradley had retreated to Redstone Ridge, building walls between himself and the world that had betrayed him so thoroughly. "How could you?" Josephine's voice trembled. "You saw how devastated he was. He loved her." "Love isn't enough to build a future on. I learned that lesson the hard way." Another silence, heavier than before. "What's happened, Martha?" Josephine asked finally, her tone gentler. "You weren't always this calculating, this bitter." The sound of pacing footsteps. Then Martha's voice, stripped of its usual confidence. "Edward is leaving me." "What? But your letters said everything was—" "I lied." The words fell like stones. "The great Boston society marriage that you and Bradley were so quick to mock has been a sham for nearly a year. Edward has been traveling on business to visit his mistress in New York, a dancer barely 20 years old." "Oh, Martha, he wants a divorce. Can you imagine the scandal? A Morgan divorced?" Martha's voice caught. "Everything I've sacrificed, every compromise, every social obligation fulfilled perfectly, and he discards me like last season's gown. Why didn't you tell us?" Josephine asked softly. "And admit failure? To Bradley, who warned me against the match? To you, who chose freedom over duty?" Martha's bitter laugh cut through the air. "I'd rather die. Is that why you're so determined to see Bradley settled with Cecilia? To prove your way wasn't wrong, just unlucky?" The silence stretched so long that Kendra began to think Martha wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, perhaps, or perhaps I simply want someone in this family to have the success I couldn't achieve. Kendra backed away silently, the tray steady in her hands despite her racing thoughts. She retreated down the hallway and into a small sitting room, closing the door behind her. The revelation of Martha's manipulation of Bradley's life, her orchestration of Eleanor's departure, explained so much. His isolation, his reluctance to return east, his wariness of society connections, and Martha's own failed marriage explained her desperate attempts to control her siblings' lives. If she couldn't find happiness herself, she would ensure it for them, whether they wanted her version of success or not. The knowledge altered Kendra's understanding of the Morgan family dynamics entirely. Martha wasn't simply a controlling older sister. She was a wounded woman trying to prevent her siblings from making what she perceived as her own mistakes, regardless of the cost to their happiness. Kendra waited several minutes, composing herself, then deliberately rattled the silverware as she approached the morning room again. This time she knocked firmly before entering. "Your afternoon tea, ladies," she announced, her voice betraying nothing of what she'd overheard. Martha sat rigidly by the window, her usual perfect posture a shield against vulnerability. Josephine's eyes were suspiciously bright, though she managed to smile as Kendra arranged the tea service. "Thank you, Miss Tompkins," Josephine said warmly. "These lemon tarts look delicious." Martha said nothing, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, as if searching for answers in their immutable peaks. Kendra curtsied slightly and withdrew, her mind still processing all she had learned. One thing was certain, the Morgan family carried deeper wounds than anyone in Redstone Ridge could possibly suspect. And Bradley, caught in the center of his sister's well-intentioned manipulations, deserved to know the truth. "Are you certain this is appropriate?" Kendra adjusted the borrowed riding skirt as Bradley helped her mount the chestnut mare. 3 days had passed since her first riding lesson, and while she'd gained confidence in the saddle, she remained uncertain about the propriety of accompanying her employer to the mine. "Perfectly appropriate," Bradley assured her, his hand lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I often invite guests to tour the operation. It's the lifeblood of Redstone Ridge, after all." "Yes, but those guests are usually business associates or investors, not—" Kendra hesitated, unsure how to classify her position in Bradley's life. More than a cook, perhaps, since they're almost kiss at the cliff top, but certainly not a social equal. "Not what?" Bradley's dark eyes held a challenge as he mounted his stallion. "Not someone I enjoy spending time with? Not someone whose opinion I value?" Warmth crept up Kendra's neck, having nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "Your sisters might not approve." "My sisters are shopping in town with Cecilia." Bradley's smile held a touch of mischief. "We have the day to ourselves." The thought sent a flutter through Kendra's stomach that had nothing to do with nervousness about riding. Since the cliff-top moment, Bradley had maintained a careful distance in public, though his eyes often sought hers across rooms, conveying unspoken messages that left her breathless. Only once had they managed a private moment, in the garden at dusk when he'd taken her hand briefly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a way that left her thoughts scattered like leaves in autumn wind. They rode side by side down the mountain trail, Bradley pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the early days when his father had first discovered silver in these hills. As they approached the mine entrance, activity seemed to pause briefly as workers noticed their approach. "Mr. Morgan?" A burly foreman stepped forward, removing his hat. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Kendra. "Wasn't expecting you today, sir." "Unannounced inspections keep everyone honest, Matthews." Bradley dismounted, then moved to help Kendra from her saddle. "How's the new equipment performing?" "Better than expected, sir. Output's up nearly 20% already." Bradley's smile showed genuine pleasure. "Excellent. I brought Miss Tompkins to see our operation. She's expressed an interest in understanding how silver mining works." The foreman's weathered face registered surprise, but he recovered quickly. "Welcome, miss. First time in a mine?" "Yes," Kendra admitted, somewhat overwhelmed by the busy scene. Men moving with purpose, ore carts rattling along tracks, the rhythmic sounds of pickaxes echoing from within the mountain itself. "Then you're in for a treat," Matthews gestured toward a small building near the mine entrance. "Should I fetch lamp helmets, sir?" Bradley glanced at Kendra's riding dress. Not today, I think. We'll stay above ground, viewing the processing facilities. For the next hour, Bradley led Kendra through the complex operation, explaining each step from the raw ore's extraction to the smelting process that yielded pure silver. His pride in the operation was evident in every word, every gesture as he introduced her to key personnel and demonstrated the improvements he'd implemented. This is the heart of it all, he explained as they reached a large building housing massive machinery. The new processing method that's causing such consternation among my investors. Kendra watched as crushed ore moved through a series of chemical baths and mechanical separators. It seems remarkably efficient. It is. Bradley's eyes lit with enthusiasm. The old method wasted nearly 40% of the silver content. This system reduces that waste to less than 10%. More profit, less environmental damage, better working conditions for the men. Then why are your investors concerned? Kendra asked, genuinely curious. Because it's new, untested on a large scale. Bradley's expression sobered. And because it requires significant capital investment up front if it fails, but you don't believe it will fail. His eyes met hers, warming at her confidence. No, I've tested it thoroughly on smaller batches. The science is sound. Then your investors should trust your judgment, Kendra said firmly. You've proven yourself many times over. Bradley smiled, touched by her unwavering support. If only the banking world shared your faith, Miss Tompkins. As if summoned by the words, a voice called from behind them. Morgan! Just the man I wanted to see. They turned to find a portly gentleman in an expensive suit picking his way carefully through the dusty yard. Albert Clark, president of Redstone Ridge Bank, mopped his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief as he approached. Clark. Bradley's expression cooled noticeably. What brings you to the mine? You usually prefer the comfort of your office for our discussions. Urgent business, I'm afraid. Clark's gaze flickered to Kendra, clearly wondering about her presence, but too well-mannered to question it directly. Winchester telegraphed from Denver this morning. The investors are calling a meeting next week. They want answers about this new process before committing additional funds. Bradley's jaw tightened. The preliminary results speak for themselves. Production is already up 20%, just as I predicted. Short-term results don't always translate to long-term viability, Clark countered. They're concerned about the chemical costs, the equipment maintenance, the fact that I developed this process rather than some Eastern engineer with the right connections. Bradley's voice held an edge that made Kendra glance at him in surprise. Clark had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's unfair, Morgan. We've backed your ventures when others wouldn't. At interest rates that reflected your doubts, Bradley replied evenly. I've never missed a payment, never defaulted on a loan. The mine produces more silver now than during the height of the first boom. Yet you and Winchester and the others still treat me like my father's untested son rather than a successful businessman in my own right. A tense silence fell. Kendra felt acutely aware of her presence in what should have been a private business discussion. Perhaps I should wait by the horses, she suggested quietly. No. Bradley's hand touched her elbow lightly. Please, stay. He turned back to Clark. Miss Tompkins has shown more faith in this operation during a 1-hour tour than my investors have demonstrated in 3 years. I find her perspective refreshing. Clark blinked, clearly taken aback by both the request and the implied criticism. As you wish. He cleared his throat. The meeting is scheduled for Tuesday in Denver. Winchester insists on your presence and a full demonstration of the new process's economic viability. I'll be there, Bradley said firmly, with documentation that even Winchester can't dispute. As Clark took his leave, promising to relay Bradley's acceptance, Kendra observed the subtle shift in Bradley's demeanor, the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth that hadn't been present during their tour. You don't trust him, she noted once Clark was out of earshot. Bradley's gaze followed the banker's retreating figure. Clark is a weather vane, pointing whichever way the strongest wind blows. Currently, that wind is Henry Winchester, who's never approved of my methods or my refusal to play by Boston's rules. Yet you've succeeded despite their doubts. Yes. Bradley's expression softened as he looked down at her. though sometimes I wonder if it's worth the constant battle. Kendra thought of Martha's revelation about Eleanor, of the manipulations that had shaped Bradley's life without his knowledge. What would you do if not this? Return to Boston as your sister wishes? Bradley shook his head decisively. Never. Boston represents everything I've fought to escape. The social constraints, the endless games of position and influence, the substitution of appearance for substance. His gaze held hers. I've found more honesty in a single conversation with you than in a lifetime of Boston drawing rooms. The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. Honesty is easier when you have less to lose, she said softly, thinking of her own deception about the whistling kettle. I disagree. Bradley stepped closer, lowering his voice, though no one was near enough to overhear. Honesty is most difficult when your heart is engaged, when you risk not just reputation or position, but the regard of someone who matters deeply. The implication hung between them, clear as the mountain air. Kendra's pulse quickened as Bradley's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then returned to her eyes. Mr. Morgan? Matthew's voice broke the moment. Got a situation with the primary crusher that needs your attention, sir. Bradley sighed, stepping back to a proper distance. Duty calls. Would you mind waiting a few minutes while I address this? Of course not, Kendra assured him, grateful for the moment to compose herself. As Bradley strode away with Matthews, Kendra wandered toward a group of miners taking their midday meal in the shade of a large cottonwood. They nodded respectfully as she approached, several touching their caps in greeting. Fine day, miss, offered an older man with silver threading his beard. Enjoying your tour of the operation? Very much, Kendra replied, smiling. Mr. Morgan has built something impressive here. That he has, the miner agreed. Different from his father, young Bradley is. How so? Kendra asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. The men exchanged glances, then the older miner continued. Old Jonathan Morgan was a dreamer, but hard as nails when it came to business. Drove men like pack horses, he did. Cared more for silver than the souls digging it out. Another miner, younger but with a deep scar running along his jawline, nodded agreement. Young Mr. Morgan, though, he works alongside us when there's trouble, knows every man by name, asks after families. When Jenkins lost his arm in that cave-in last winter, Mr. Morgan paid the doctor bills and kept him on as a watchman. And the new processing method is safer, added a third man. Less dust in the lungs, fewer chemicals burning the skin. My cough's improved considerable since the change. Kendra B. listened, absorbing these testimonials from men who knew Bradley, not as the wealthy mine owner or Martha's rebellious brother, but as the employer who treated them with dignity and concern for their welfare. The Eastern investors don't understand, the older miner concluded, shaking his head. All they see is dollars and cents on paper. They don't see how Mr. Morgan's improvements make for loyal workers who go the extra mile. Before Kendra could respond, Bradley returned, his hands bearing traces of machine oil despite the handkerchief he was using to clean them. Crisis averted, he announced, smiling at the gathered miners. Thompson, how's that boy of yours? Recovered from the measles? Right as rain, sir, thank you for asking, the scarred miner replied, standing a little straighter. Wife says to thank you for the medicine you sent. Bradley waved away the gratitude. Least I could do. We need him healthy. He's already showing signs of being a better mathematician than his father, if his calculations on those ore samples are any indication. The easy camaraderie between Bradley and his workers struck Kendra forcefully. This was no distant employer issuing orders from an office. This was a man who understood that his success depended on the men who labored for him and who treated them accordingly. As they rode back toward the mansion later, the afternoon sun gilding the mountainsides in gold and amber, Kendra found herself studying Bradley's profile with new understanding. The man who had shown her the mine operations with such pride was neither the Boston society gentleman Martha wanted him to be, nor the ruthless businessman his father had been. He was something entirely his own. A man who had found his purpose and his principles, who valued substance over appearance in all things. You're staring, Miss Tompkins, Bradley observed without looking at her, though a smile played at the corners of his mouth. Do I have soot on my face? Kendra blushed at being caught. No, I was just thinking. About? About how different you are from what people say, she admitted. The miners speak of you with genuine respect, not just the deference owed to an employer. Bradley glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. You've been investigating me? Observing, she corrected. There's a difference. He chuckled, the sound warm in the cooling afternoon air. And what have your observations revealed? Kendra considered her response carefully. That you've built something here worth fighting for? Not just a profitable mine, but a community where men are valued for their contributions, not just their output. Bradley reined his horse to a stop, turning in his saddle to face her fully. That may be the most insightful assessment of my work I've ever received. His voice had softened, his dark eyes searching hers. Most see only the silver and the profit it brings. I see the man, Kendra said simply. For a moment they remained still, the horses shifting beneath them as something unspoken passed between rider and rider, a recognition, an understanding that transcended words. Then Bradley smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious features. I'm beginning to think bringing you to the mine was a dangerous decision, Miss Tompkins. Dangerous, she echoed, confused. Indeed. His eyes held a warmth that sent a flutter through her chest. For how can I maintain a proper employer's distance when you see me so clearly and still look at me with such approval in those remarkable eyes? Before Kendra could formulate a response to this unexpected declaration, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment. Bradley straightened in his saddle, his expression cooling to polite interest as a group of miners rounded the bend in the trail ahead. But as they continued their journey home, Kendra was acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted between them, a boundary crossed that could not be reestablished. A truth acknowledged that would shape all their future interactions. Bradley Morgan, owner of the richest silver mine in the territory, respected businessman and heir to Boston society, had all but declared his interest in his cook, and Kendra Tompkins, daughter of Joseph Tompkins, struggling owner of the Whistling Kettle, had revealed her admiration for the man himself, not his position or wealth. What would come of such a confession, Kendra couldn't begin to imagine. But as they crested the ridge and the Morgan mansion came into view, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, she knew with sudden clarity that the secrets she still kept about the Whistling Kettle, about her embellished credentials, could no longer remain hidden if there was to be any hope for the feelings growing between them. Truth would be required whatever the cost. The only question was whether she had the courage to offer it, and whether Bradley Morgan would find her worthy once he knew the full measure of her deception. McAllister's general store hummed with activity as Kendra examined the selection of baking chocolate. Easter was but days away, and she had promised Bradley a chocolate cake unlike any his sisters had tasted in Boston drawing rooms. The holiday preparations had consumed most of her waking hours, leaving little time for the personal conversations she and Bradley skirted around during their brief encounters. Belgian chocolate for a mining town? How ambitious! The voice, cultured and faintly amused, cut through Kendra's thoughts like a blade through butter. She turned to find herself face to face with a striking woman in a fashionable traveling suit of deep blue. Though they had never been introduced, Kendra recognized her immediately from Bradley's descriptions. The delicate features, the cornflower blue eyes, the air of refined confidence. Mrs. Harrington, Kendra said, inclining her head slightly. Surprise flickered across Eleanor Harrington's perfect features. You have me at a disadvantage. You know my name, yet I don't recall making your acquaintance. Kendra Tompkins. I'm employed at the Morgan household. Kendra kept her voice neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Ah. Eleanor's gaze swept over Kendra, taking in her simple dress and market basket. The new cook, I presume? Abel was always so particular about his ingredients. I see his replacement shares his discerning taste, if not his credentials. The deliberate emphasis on the word credentials sent a chill down Kendra's spine. Had Cecilia's suspicions spread beyond the Morgan household? Mr. Morgan appreciates quality in his kitchen, Kendra replied evenly, as I'm sure you remember. Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Indeed, though Bradley's appreciation sometimes extends beyond what's appropriate, a trait I'm certain you've noticed. The implication hung in the air between them. clear as crystal and twice as cutting. Kendra's cheeks warmed, but she held Eleanor's gaze without flinching. "Mr. Morgan has been nothing but professionally courteous," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "His treatment of staff speaks well of his character. How diplomatic." Eleanor selected a tin of imported tea from a nearby shelf, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Tell me, Miss Tompkins, do all the servants at Morgan Manor receive personal riding lessons from the master of the house? The town has been positively buzzing with the tale." Kendra's fingers tightened around her basket handle. Of course, their ride to the mine had generated gossip. Everything connected to Bradley Morgan became fodder for Redstone Ridge's rumor mill. "I required instruction to properly fulfill my duties accompanying Mr. Morgan to inspect kitchen garden sites," Kendra improvised, keeping her voice low to avoid the attention of other shoppers. Eleanor laughed, the sound like delicate bells. "How resourceful you are. No wonder you've caught Bradley's eye. He always did appreciate quick thinking, especially in pretty packages." "Is there a problem here?" Daniel's deep voice cut through the tension as he approached, his limp more pronounced after a long day's work. He positioned himself beside Kendra, his expression darkening as he took in Eleanor's fine clothes and condescending smile. "No problem at all," Eleanor replied smoothly. "Simply becoming acquainted with your sister. I understand she's quite the favorite at Morgan Manor these days." Daniel's jaw tightened. "My sister is a skilled cook who would be an asset to any household fortunate enough to employ her." "I'm sure she possesses many talents," Eleanor agreed, her tone making the words sound far from complimentary, "though I would caution any young woman about becoming too indispensable to a man like Bradley Morgan. His attention can be flattering, but ultimately fleeting." "Speaks the woman who returned his ring for a banker's fortune," Daniel shot back, his voice rising enough to draw glances from nearby shoppers. Eleanor's cheeks paled beneath her careful complexion. "You overstep, sir. And you presume too much about my sister's character based on your own actions," Daniel countered, stepping closer despite Kendra's restraining hand on his arm. "That's enough, Daniel." Sheriff Taylor's authoritative voice cut through the brewing confrontation as he approached from the hardware section. "Mrs. Harrington, this is an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware you were visiting Redstone Ridge." Eleanor composed herself quickly, turning a practiced smile toward the lawman. "Sheriff Taylor, how good to see you again. I'm simply passing through on my way to Denver. My husband has business interests requiring attention." "I see." The sheriff's weathered face revealed nothing, though his eyes flicked briefly to Kendra with something like concern. "Mr. Tompkins, didn't you mention needing those fence posts delivered to the Peterson place this afternoon?" The dismissal was clear. Daniel hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Kendra alone with Eleanor. "I'm nearly finished here," Kendra assured him, squeezing his arm gently. "I'll see you at supper tomorrow, as planned." Daniel nodded curtly, shooting a final warning glance toward Eleanor before limping toward the door, his rigid posture broadcasting his displeasure to anyone watching. "Such protective brothers are a blessing," Eleanor observed once Daniel had gone, "though one might wonder why he feels such protection necessary." "Family looks after its own," Sheriff Taylor interjected before Kendra could respond. "The Tompkins have weathered their share of hardships with dignity." "Of course." Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, I should continue my errands. The stagecoach leaves at 3. She turned to Kendra, her voice dropping. "A pleasure making your acquaintance, Miss Tompkins. Do give Bradley my regards, and perhaps a friendly caution about investing too heavily in untested methods. Some gambles, no matter how promising, end in disappointment." With that parting shot, she glided away toward the fabric section, leaving Kendra and the sheriff in uncomfortable silence. "Don't take it to heart," Taylor advised quietly once Eleanor was out of earshot. "Mrs. Harrington harbors her own regrets, I suspect." Kendra placed the chocolate in her basket with hands that weren't quite steady. "You seem familiar with the situation, Sheriff." Taylor sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through graying hair. "Been sheriff here 15 years. Watched Bradley Morgan grow from a bookish young man into the owner of the biggest silver mine in the territory. Saw how that woman's rejection nearly broke him." "You sound almost protective of him." Kendra observed, surprised by the sheriff's tone. "Don't mistake me," Taylor clarified. "The Morgans have caused their share of problems in this town. Old Jonathan would have drained our water supply dry if your father hadn't rallied the businesses against him. And Bradley's got his father's stubbornness, no question." "But," Kendra prompted, sensing there was more. "But he's his own man, too. Pays fair wages, improved safety at the mine after that collapse that injured your brother, contributed to the school fund and the church rebuilding without making a show of it." Taylor settled his hat back on his head. "Town's divided on Bradley Morgan. Some see only his father's son with too much power. Others see a man trying to do right while building something lasting." "And which do you see?" Kendra asked, genuinely curious. Taylor's weathered face creased in a half smile. "I see a man who's been watching my deputy's sister with more than employer's interest. A man who might be wading into complicated waters without realizing the currents." Heat flooded Kendra's cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Taylor's kind eyes held no judgment, only concern. "Redstone Ridge runs on silver and gossip, Ms. Tompkins. Your rides with Bradley Morgan haven't gone unnoticed, nor has his defense of you against his sister's complaints." Kendra busied herself arranging items in her basket, avoiding the sheriff's perceptive gaze. "Mr. Morgan has been kind to all his staff." "If you say so." Taylor clearly didn't believe her, but was gentlemanly enough not to press. "Just remember that the Morgans cast long shadows in this town, and not everyone standing in that shadow wishes him well. Be careful you don't get caught between old grudges and new possibilities." With a tip of his hat, the sheriff moved away, leaving Kendra to complete her purchases with a mind unsettled by both Eleanor's cutting remarks and Taylor's cryptic warning. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, the spring sunshine did little to warm the chill that had settled in her bones. Eleanor's calculated barbs revealed a woman still bitter about her choices. Yet her warning about Bradley's business ventures matched what Kendra had overheard about the investors' concerns. And the sheriff's observations confirmed what she'd begun to suspect, that Bradley Morgan's position in Redstone Ridge was far more complicated than simple wealth could explain. He was neither wholly embraced nor entirely rejected by the community, but existed in a precarious balance between his father's contentious legacy and his own evolving reputation, a position not unlike her own, Kendra realized with sudden clarity, neither fully servant nor social equal, caught between worlds with her embellished credentials and growing feelings for a man far above her station. Whatever was developing between them would face opposition from all sides: his sisters, the town, the weight of their different positions. The question Kendra couldn't answer as she made her way back to the Morgan mansion with her precious chocolate was whether what they might build together would be strong enough to withstand those pressures, or whether, like Eleanor, she would someday find herself making the practical choice over the one her heart whispered was right. The kitchen gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight as Kendra put the finishing touches on a test version of her Easter chocolate cake. The rich aroma of Flemish cocoa filled the air, mixing pleasantly with the vanilla and almond extracts she'd splurged on from McAllister's inventory of imported goods. So absorbed was she in her work that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until Bradley's voice broke the silence. "Something smells divine," Kendra started, nearly dropping the silver spatula she'd been using to smooth the chocolate ganache. "Mr. Morgan, I didn't expect you back from the mine so soon." Bradley stood in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. Despite the evidence of a long day overseeing mine operations, the faint dust on his boots, the slight dishevelment of his usually immaculate hair, he looked unfairly handsome in the golden afternoon light. "The figures for Denver couldn't wait," he explained, approaching the work table with interest. "But I find myself distracted by whatever masterpiece you're creating." "Hardly a masterpiece," Kendra demurred, though she couldn't help a small surge of pride as she regarded the perfectly frosted cake. "Simply a test for Easter Sunday. I want everything to be perfect for your guests." Bradley's fingers brushed a speck of chocolate from the table's edge, bringing it to his lips with a thoughtfulness that made Kendra's breath catch. "Belgian chocolate," he observed. "You went to considerable expense." "You pay me well," she reminded him, wiping her hands on her apron to hide their sudden trembling. "And Easter deserves something special. 3 days had passed since their ride to the mine, 3 days of careful distance maintained whenever Martha or Cecilia might observe them. Yet in the quiet moments, passing on the stairs, chance meetings in the garden, the brief exchange of glances during meals, something unspoken continued to grow between them, fragile as a spring seedling, but just as determined to reach the light. "Speaking of Easter," Bradley said, setting his portfolio aside, "there's the matter of the Easter ball on Saturday evening." "Miss Martha has everything planned," Kendra assured him. "The menu is finalized, and Mr. Harrison has arranged for additional staff from town to serve." "I'm not concerned about the arrangements." Bradley moved closer, his voice dropping slightly, though they were alone in the kitchen. "I'm concerned about having the right companion for the evening." Kendra's hands stilled on the frosting spatula. "Surely Miss Winthrop expects to accompany you. She's made her interest quite clear." A smile tugged at the corner of Bradley's mouth. "Cecilia's expectations are not my concern. I would like you to accompany me to the ball, Kendra." The spatula clattered against the work table as Kendra's fingers went suddenly nerveless. "Me? But I'm your cook, not what?" Bradley challenged softly. "Not worthy of an evening's entertainment after weeks of satisfying my sister's impossible demands? Not entitled to enjoy the celebration you've worked so hard to prepare?" "People would talk," Kendra protested weakly, though her heart had begun a rapid tattoo against her ribs. "People already talk." Bradley's dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made rational thought difficult. "Half the town believes I'm following my father's ruthless footsteps. The other half thinks I'm squandering my inheritance on mining innovations. Why should I suddenly care about their opinions on whom I escort to a dance?" Kendra thought of Eleanor's cutting remarks, of Sheriff Taylor's veiled warnings. "Your sisters would be scandalized. My sisters have been attempting to orchestrate my life for too long," Bradley said firmly. "Martha is determined to see me married to Cecilia and return to Boston society before summer's end. I'm equally determined to make my own choices, in business and in personal matters." The implication hung between them, clear as the mountain air after a spring rain. Kendra busied herself wiping non-existent crumbs from the work table, her mind racing with the implications of his invitation. "I have nothing suitable to wear," she said finally, voicing the practical concern that seemed safest among the tumult of her thoughts. Bradley smiled, recognizing the token objection for what it was. "I've taken the liberty of speaking with Mrs. Winters. Apparently Josephine left several evening gowns that, with minor alterations, would suit you admirably." "You've planned for everything," Kendra observed, not knowing whether to be flattered or alarmed by his thoroughness. "Not everything," Bradley admitted, his expression sobering. "I cannot predict how you'll answer my invitation." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. This was Bradley Morgan, successful mine owner, respected businessman. Yet he stood before her with uncertainty in his eyes, awaiting her decision as if it carried the weight of those Denver investors' judgments. Before Kendra could respond, the kitchen door swung open to admit Martha Morgan, her expression shifting from purpose to displeasure as she took in the scene. Bradley standing too close to Kendra, the intimate atmosphere that no amount of hasty stepping back could quite dispel. "There you are, Bradley. Mrs. Winters said you'd returned." Martha's gaze flicked dismissively over Kendra before returning to her brother. "I need your approval on the final guest list for Saturday. Several Denver associates have accepted, including the Winchesters." "Of course they have," Bradley murmured, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Henry never misses an opportunity to evaluate my operation while appearing supportive." Martha's lips thinned at his tone. "The Winchesters have been loyal investors despite your unconventional methods. Their good opinion matters. Their money matters," Bradley corrected coolly. "Their opinion is considerably less valuable than that of the men who actually work the mine." He gestured toward the leather portfolio he'd set aside. "The production figures speak for themselves. Silver output is up 23% with the new processing method, and accidents are down nearly 40%. Winchester can hardly argue with those results. Figures on paper don't always translate to sustained success," Martha countered, echoing the investors' concerns with such precision that Kendra wondered if she'd been corresponding with them directly. In any case, we should discuss the guest list privately. The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. Kendra began gathering her baking implements, preparing to retreat to the pantry until the siblings' discussion concluded. Actually, there's a matter concerning the ball we should settle now, Bradley said, his voice taking on the quiet authority Kendra had heard him use at the mine. I've invited Miss Tompkins to accompany me on Saturday evening. Martha went very still, only the sudden whitening of her knuckles against her dark skirt betraying her shock. I must have misunderstood. You've invited your cook to attend the Easter ball as your guest? As my companion for the evening, yes. Bradley's expression remained calm, though Kendra detected the slight squaring of his shoulders that signaled his readiness for confrontation. That's absurd, Martha declared, her cultured voice edged with disbelief. The Easter ball is the social event of the season. Every prominent family in the region will attend. You cannot possibly escort a servant. Miss Tompkins is an employee, not a servant, Bradley corrected, his tone sharpening. And I can and will escort whomever I choose. Martha's gaze swung to Kendra, cold as a January blizzard. You've overstepped your position in this household. I don't know what notions you've entertained or encouraged, but this is most inappropriate. Kendra straightened, her father's stubborn pride rising to the surface despite her precarious position. I assure you, Miss Morgan, I neither suggested nor expected Mr. Morgan's invitation. If my presence would cause embarrassment to your family, I'll certainly decline. The only embarrassment, Bradley interjected firmly, would be my appearing with Cecilia Winthrop on my arm when my interest clearly lies elsewhere. The blunt declaration hung in the air between them. Martha inhaled sharply, her composure cracking to reveal genuine alarm beneath the social disapproval. Have you taken leave of your senses? Consider your position, your responsibilities, the investors arriving from Denver, the business connections at stake. I've considered everything, Bradley interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. My position is secure, my business successful by any measure. The mine operates at a profit that would astonish Father. I've fulfilled every obligation to the Morgan name except the one you and Boston society seem to think most important, marrying according to someone else's expectations rather than my own heart. The word heart sent a tremor through Kendra's chest. Surely he couldn't mean what the word implied. Martha must have recognized the same implication, for her expression shifted from outrage to calculation. This is about Eleanor, isn't it? You've heard she's in town, and this is some misguided attempt to prove you've moved beyond her rejection. Eleanor? Bradley looked genuinely startled. She's in Redstone Ridge. Kendra winced internally. After her encounter with Eleanor at the Mercantile, she should have mentioned the woman's presence to Bradley, but the right moment never seemed to present itself. You didn't know? Martha's gaze shifted between them, noting Kendra's discomfort with sudden perception. But you did, she said to Kendra, her voice sharpening. You encountered her. What did she say to you? Trapped. Kendra saw no option but honesty. We met briefly at McAllister's yesterday. She mentioned she was passing through on her way to Denver. And you didn't think to mention this? Bradley asked, his brow furrowing not in anger but in concern. It didn't seem relevant, Kendra replied truthfully. Mrs. Harrington expressed no desire to renew acquaintances. Bradley studied her face for a moment, then nodded, accepting her explanation without further question. The simple trust in the gesture touched Kendra deeply, especially given her continued deception about her background. Martha observed the exchange with growing comprehension and evident dismay. This is more serious than I thought, she murmured, almost to herself. Then, more directly to her brother, Bradley, I implore you to consider what you're doing. The social implications aside, you know nothing about this woman's family, her background, her suitability. I know everything I need to know, Bradley cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kendra Tompkins is intelligent, capable, honest in all things that matter, and sees me for myself rather than the Morgan fortune or position. That alone makes her more suitable than the parade of appropriate candidates you and Boston society have presented over the years. The praise warmed Kendra, even as guilt twisted in her stomach. Honest in all things that matter. Would he still believe that when he learned the full extent of her deception? Martha recognized defeat when she saw it. Drawing herself up with wounded dignity, she nodded stiffly. I see your mind is made up. I only hope you won't come to regret this impulsiveness. The Easter ball is hardly the appropriate venue for such a statement." "On the contrary," Bradley replied, his expression softening slightly at his sister's evident distress. "Easter is about new beginnings, is it not? Perhaps it's exactly the right time." With that philosophical observation, he effectively dismissed his sister's objections. Martha, recognizing she would gain nothing by pressing further, retreated with as much grace as wounded pride would allow. When the door closed behind her, silence settled over the kitchen like dust after a storm. Kendra found herself unable to meet Bradley's gaze, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, elation at his defense of her, fear of the consequences, and the ever-present guilt about the truth she continued to withhold. "I've put you in an awkward position," Bradley said finally, breaking the silence. "For that, I apologize." Kendra looked up, finding not regret in his expression but genuine concern for her comfort. "Your sister isn't wrong about the social implications," she said softly. "People will talk. Let them." Bradley moved closer, though he maintained a proper distance given the open door and the household's awareness of their conversation. "I've spent 3 years rebuilding my life after Eleanor's rejection, focusing solely on the mine and proving my father's vision correct. In all that time, I never once encountered someone who made me question whether success alone was enough." "Until now?" Kendra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bradley's smile held a warmth that reached his eyes, transforming his usually serious features until a forthright cook with flour on her cheek and opinions on everything from bread consistency to mining operations reminded me that there are more important things than Boston society's approval. The description, so at odds with the elegant companions Martha envisioned for him, made Kendra laugh despite her nervousness. "You paint a flattering picture, Mr. Morgan." "Bradley," he corrected gently, "at least when we're alone. And it's not flattery if it's true." He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a smudge of chocolate from her cheek with his thumb. The brief contact sent warmth cascading through her body, settling in a flutter behind her ribs. "Will you accompany me to the Easter ball, Kendra?" he asked again, his voice low and serious. "Not as my cook or my employee, but as the woman who has come to matter more to me than I thought possible in so short a time." In that moment, with Bradley's dark eyes holding hers and the afternoon sun painting the kitchen in gold, Kendra knew she should refuse, should explain about the whistling kettle, about her embellished credentials, about the gulf between their worlds that no Easter ball invitation could truly bridge. Instead, against all better judgment and practical consideration, she heard herself say, "Yes, I'd be honored to accompany you." The smile that illuminated Bradley's face was worth whatever consequences might follow. For now, in this quiet kitchen where they had first begun to see beyond their prescribed roles, Kendra allowed herself to believe that perhaps Easter truly could bring new beginnings. Even to a woman who had built her current position on half-truths and a man whose family expected him to marry for advantage rather than affection. Tomorrow would bring its own complications. For today, the acceptance of his invitation was enough. Chapter 6. Preparations and Revelations. "Stand still, please," Josephine murmured around a mouthful of pins as she knelt beside Kendra, adjusting the hem of a gown the color of spring lilacs. "I'm certain Mrs. Winters would do a better job, but then we'd have to explain why we're altering my old ball gown." Kendra shifted uncomfortably on the small footstool in Josephine's bedchamber, painfully aware of her unsuitable presence among the young woman's elegant belongings. Crystal perfume bottles caught the afternoon sunlight, casting prism rainbows across silk-papered walls. A silver-backed brush set gleamed on the vanity beside kid gloves so fine Kendra feared touching them would leave smudges. "Miss Morgan, truly, this isn't necessary. I could wear my Sunday dress with a new ribbon." "Josephine, please," the younger woman corrected, sitting back on her heels to assess her handiwork. "And your Sunday dress, while perfectly respectable for church, would make you conspicuous for all the wrong reasons at the Easter ball." Josephine tilted her head consideringly. "Besides, this gown never suited me. The color washed out my complexion terribly, but with your chestnut hair and warm skin, it's perfect." "It's exquisite," Kendra admitted, running her fingers over the silk overskirt with its delicate beading. But your sister will recognize it immediately. Josephine grinned impishly. That's half the fun, isn't it? Martha has been insufferable since we arrived, ordering everyone about as if she were Queen Victoria herself. Her expression sobered. Besides, I've never seen Bradley look at anyone the way he looks at you, not even Eleanor. Kendra's heart skipped at the observation. I'm sure you're mistaken. Mr. Morgan has been kind. That's all. Kind? Josephine snorted, in a most unladylike manner. Bradley defied Martha publicly to invite you to the ball. My brother is many things, but impulsive isn't one of them. He knew exactly what he was doing, and what it would cost him. The reminder of Martha's fury made Kendra's stomach tighten. For 2 days, the elder Morgan sister had maintained a glacial politeness that was somehow worse than open hostility, issuing kitchen instructions through Mrs. Winters rather than addressing Kendra directly. I shouldn't have accepted, Kendra said softly, voicing the doubt that had plagued her since that moment in the kitchen. It's caused nothing but discord in your family. Josephine rose, dusting pins from her skirt. This discord, as you call it, has been brewing for years. Martha cannot accept that Bradley has built a life that doesn't follow her carefully plotted course. She smiled gently at Kendra's uncertain expression. Don't mistake me. I love my sister, but her determination to control everyone around her has brought her little happiness and cost her much. A soft knock at the door made both women start guiltily. Josephine hurried to answer it, opening the door just enough to reveal Mrs. Winters on the threshold. Miss Josephine, the housekeeper whispered urgently, Miss Martha is looking for you. She mentioned something about Easter bonnet ribbons that need your opinion. Tell her I'll be down shortly, Josephine replied, casting an apologetic glance toward Kendra. And Mrs. Winters, not a word about our project. The housekeeper's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Of course, Miss Josephine, I've seen nothing unusual whatsoever. When the door closed, Josephine turned back to Kendra with newfound urgency. We'll have to finish later. Can you manage the gown by yourself? I think so, Kendra said, already working at the tiny buttons along the bodice. Thank you, Miss Josephine. Your kindness means more than I can express. Josephine waved away the gratitude. Meet me here after dinner, when Martha's occupied with Cecilia's final fitting. We'll need to decide what to do with your hair. She cast a critical eye over Kendra's practical bun. Perhaps a few curls framing your face? Nothing too elaborate. Your natural beauty needs little enhancement. The compliment, delivered with such unaffected sincerity, brought a flush to Kendra's cheeks. No one had ever called her beautiful before, let alone a society-bred young woman who had doubtless been surrounded by genuine beauties in Boston's exclusive circles. You're very kind, she murmured, carefully stepping out of the gown. I'm very honest, Josephine corrected with a smile. Bradley sees it too, not just your pretty face, but the spirit behind it. She hesitated, then added more seriously, whatever happens at the ball or after, know that you've awakened something in my brother that I feared was lost forever when Eleanor broke their engagement. For that alone, I would help you prepare 100 ball gowns. With that declaration, Josephine slipped from the room, leaving Kendra to gather the precious gown and hide it in the wardrobe for later alterations. As she made her way back to the kitchen via the servants' stairs, Kendra's thoughts whirled like autumn leaves in a dust devil. Josephine's acceptance was unexpected but welcome. Yet it only highlighted the growing complications of her position in the Morgan household. Bradley's invitation had transformed her from a mere employee to something undefined. Not quite family friend, certainly not a suitable match in Martha's eyes, yet no longer content to remain simply the cook. And beneath it all lay the persistent guilt about her deception, the embellished credentials that had secured her position, the truth about the whistling kettle that she continued to conceal despite growing opportunities to reveal it. How could anything genuine grow from such a foundation of half-truths? Lost in these troubled thoughts, Kendra nearly collided with Martha and Cecilia as they ascended the main staircase. She flattened herself against the wall, murmuring an apology as the women passed. Really, Bradley must speak to the staff about appropriate corridors, Martha remarked to Cecilia, as if Kendra were invisible or incapable of understanding. The servants have perfectly adequate stairs for their use. Cecilia's gaze lingered on Kendra, a calculating assessment that set warning bells ringing. Perhaps Miss Tompkins was attending to preparations for the ball. I understand she has a special interest in the event. The deliberately provocative comment hung in the air like gun smoke. Martha's expression tightened, but she maintained her composure as they continued up the stairs, their voices dropping to murmurs that Kendra couldn't quite distinguish, except for one phrase, clear as crystal in Cecilia's honey-sweet tones. Teach the little upstart her proper place. You can't be serious, Ken. Daniel Tompkins set down his coffee cup with enough force to rattle the saucer, drawing glances from nearby patrons at the hotel dining room. The Easter ball with Bradley Morgan? Kendra had chosen this meeting place deliberately, knowing the busy hotel restaurant offered more privacy than the Whistling Kettle's closed dining room. Here, they were simply two more customers among the drummers, travelers, and local businessmen enjoying a late breakfast. Keep your voice down, she admonished, glancing around nervously. Half the town is already gossiping about the invitation. I don't need you adding fuel to the fire. Daniel leaned forward, his expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. What were you thinking? You were hired to cook for the man, not dance with him at the social event of the season. I didn't expect the invitation, Kendra protested, though even to her own ears the defense sounded weak. It caught me by surprise. But you accepted, Daniel pointed out, stirring his coffee with unnecessary vigor. After weeks of pretending to be something you're not, you've now agreed to parade yourself before the entire town on the arm of the richest man in the territory. What happens when someone mentions the Whistling Kettle, when they ask about your non-existent experience in Santa Fe? Each question landed like a physical blow. Kendra stared into her teacup, unable to meet her brother's worried gaze. I know the risks, she said quietly, but Daniel, he's not what we thought. Not what Pa believed either. So now Bradley Morgan is a misunderstood saint? Daniel's skepticism couldn't have been plainer. The man whose father tried to steal the town's water rights? Whose mine practices drove smaller operations out of business? The man who improved safety measures after your accident, Kendra countered. Who knows his workers by name and asks after their families? Who defended a mere cook against his society sister's disapproval? Daniel studied her face for a long moment, his expression softening with dawning realization. You care for him? It wasn't a question. Kendra looked away, unable to deny what must be written across her features as clearly as words on a page. It doesn't matter how I feel. After the ball, I'll tell him everything. About the Whistling Kettle, about my exaggerated credentials. He deserves the truth. And then what? Daniel asked gently. Say he forgives the deception. Say he still wants your company. Where does that leave you, Ken? A poor cook from a struggling eatery and the owner of the richest silver mine in Colorado Territory? Those worlds don't mix, no matter how progressive Bradley Morgan might be. You think I don't know that? Kendra's voice caught on the words. Every day I spend in that mansion reminds me of the gulf between us. The silver service that costs more than the Whistling Kettle's entire inventory. The casual mention of European trips and Boston seasons as if they're no more remarkable than a journey to Denver. Daniel reached across the table to cover her hand with his. Then why put yourself through this? Why risk the humiliation when Martha Morgan inevitably finds a way to remind everyone of your station? Kendra met her brother's concerned gaze, finding the words she'd been unable to admit, even to herself. Because when Bradley looks at me, he doesn't see a cook or Joseph Tompkins' daughter or a woman with or without the right background. He sees me, Daniel. Just me. As if that's enough. More than enough. Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes, followed quickly by the protective concern that had guided his actions since their parents' deaths. Oh, Ken, you've fallen in love with him. The simple truth of it, spoken aloud for the first time, brought unexpected tears to Kendra's eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to create a scene in the busy restaurant. Foolish, isn't it? A few weeks in his household, a handful of conversations, and here I am risking everything for one evening where I can pretend the differences between us don't matter. Not foolish, Daniel corrected softly. Human. But Ken, Even if Morgan returns your feelings, what future could there be? His family would never accept you. Society would ostracize you both. You'd be trapped between worlds, too elevated for Redstone Ridge, never quite good enough for Boston. I know. Kendra withdrew her hand, gathering strength from the familiar weight of responsibility that had shaped her life since her parents' deaths. That's why I've decided to resign after Easter, regardless of how Bradley responds to my confession. The whistling kettle needs me, and my time at the Morgan estate was always meant to be temporary. Daniel nodded, relief evident in his posture. The wages you've earned will keep the eatery open through summer at least. By then, the drought should break and business will improve naturally. He hesitated, then added more gently, and perhaps some distance from Bradley Morgan will help heal whatever's growing between you before it becomes too painful to sever. Kendra nodded, though her heart contracted at the thought of never again seeing Bradley's rare smile, or hearing his quiet laughter during their private conversations. You're right, of course. One night of make-believe at the Easter ball, then back to reality. Just be careful, Ken. Daniel's expression remained troubled. Martha Morgan struck me as a woman who doesn't take defeat gracefully, and that friend of hers, Cecilia, has the look of someone who eliminates obstacles permanently. They can hardly murder me for accepting a dance invitation, Kendra said, attempting levity, though Daniel's concern had rekindled her own unease about Cecilia's parting words on the staircase. There are many ways to destroy a person without physical harm, Daniel replied grimly. Promise me you'll guard yourself, not just your heart, but your dignity. If they attempt to humiliate you, walk away with your head high. Remember you're Joseph Tompkins' daughter, and he never bowed to any Morgan, no matter how powerful. I promise, Kendra said, squeezing her brother's hand. One night of fairy tales, then back to being Cinderella among the cinders. Daniel's answering smile held more sadness than humor. Just make sure you're the one who leaves the ball on your own terms, not because the clock strikes midnight and someone else shatters the illusion. As they parted outside the hotel, Kendra couldn't shake the foreboding that had settled over her like a shadow. Daniel was right about the risks, about the impossibility of bridging the worlds that separated her from Bradley, about Martha and Cecilia's determination to protect the Morgan name from what they would consider an unsuitable attachment. Yet even knowing all this, Kendra couldn't bring herself to regret accepting Bradley's invitation. For one evening, she would set aside the barriers of class and background. She would dance in his arms, perhaps even discover if the almost kiss at the cliff top might have led somewhere worth the risk of heartbreak. And afterward, whether Bradley forgave her deception or not, she would return to the whistling kettle with memories to sustain her through whatever future awaited. Memories of one perfect night when Kendra Tompkins danced with the man who had seen beyond her station to the woman beneath. One night of dreams before reality reclaimed its due. It seemed little enough to ask, despite the voice in her heart that whispered it might never be enough once tasted. The church bell tolled across Redstone Ridge, its clear notes summoning the faithful from the smallest miner's cabin to the grandest home on the hill. Kendra smoothed the front of her best dress, a serviceable navy blue with only one carefully hidden mend at the seam, as she waited in the foyer of the Morgan mansion. She had risen before dawn to prepare Easter breakfast for the household, then slipped away to change while Mrs. Winters supervised the cleanup. You needn't accompany us if you'd prefer to rest, Bradley had told her the night before, his consideration evident in the gentle tone. The kitchen staff rarely attends services with the family. Easter Sunday is important to me, Kendra had replied simply. What she didn't add was that attending church with the Morgans would be the first public acknowledgement of her shifting status in the household, a prelude to the ball that evening that had the entire town buzzing with speculation. The sound of footsteps on the marble staircase drew her attention. Bradley descended first, resplendent in a black frock coat and crisp white shirt that highlighted the breadth of his shoulders. Behind him came Josephine in a confection of spring green, her dark hair arranged artfully beneath a bonnet trimmed with silk flowers. Martha followed in deep burgundy, her spine straight as a fireplace poker, while Cecilia completed the procession in a pale blue ensemble that must have been sewn in Denver if not imported directly from the East. Bradley's eyes warmed as they fell on Kendra, a smile touching his lips before he schooled his features into something more appropriate for Sunday worship. Miss Tompkins, you look lovely. Thank you, sir. Kendra fought to keep her voice steady, aware of Martha's disapproving gaze and Cecilia's calculating assessment. The carriage awaits, Harrison announced from the doorway, his stoic expression revealing nothing of what he might think about the cook joining the family for services. Bradley offered his arm to Kendra with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken for anything but intentional. Shall we? Martha's sharply indrawn breath and Cecilia's tight smile registered peripherally as Kendra placed her gloved hand on Bradley's sleeve. Josephine winked encouragingly as they moved toward the door, her own small rebellion against her elder sister's rigid notions of propriety. The ride to town passed in strained conversation, with Martha pointedly discussing Boston acquaintances who would be utterly horrified by the frontier conditions of Redstone Ridge's modest church. Cecilia chimed in with observations about the last Easter service she'd attended at Trinity Church, where the bishop himself had officiated and the ladies' bonnets had been featured in the society pages the following day. I find Reverend Collins's sermons refreshingly direct, Bradley commented as the carriage rolled down the hill toward town. Less concerned with appearance than substance, a quality I've come to value greatly in recent years. His gaze met Kendra's briefly, the double meaning of his words clear to everyone in the carriage. Martha's lips thinned to a bloodless line, but she held her tongue as they approached the white steepled church at the center of town. A crowd had already gathered on the steps, the ladies in their Easter finery creating a garden of colorful bonnets against the men's somber Sunday suits. Conversation faltered as the Morgan carriage pulled to a stop, curious eyes watching as Bradley stepped down first, then turned to assist Kendra rather than his sisters. Scandalous, someone murmured, not quite quietly enough. Joseph Tompkins must be spinning in his grave, came another whisper. Bradley's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around Kendra's as they mounted the church steps, his expression revealing nothing of the tension she knew he must feel at this public display. For a man who valued his privacy as Bradley did, this deliberate association with his cook before the entire town represented a declaration of independence from both family expectations and society's constraint. Inside the church, the Morgans' customary pew stood empty near the front, reserved by unspoken tradition for the family whose silver had built the church and whose donations maintained it. Bradley led the way, placing Kendra beside him rather than at the outer edge where a companion of lower status would traditionally sit. Martha, forced to walk past them both to reach her place, did so with rigid dignity, her back a study in aristocratic disapproval. Whispers rustled through the congregation like wind through autumn leaves. Kendra kept her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross at the altar, drawing strength from memories of her mother's quiet faith and her father's stubborn insistence that all souls stood equal before God, regardless of wealth or station. Breathe, Bradley murmured, so softly that only she could hear. They'll find something new to gossip about by supper time. His confidence nearly made her smile, despite the weight of disapproving stares pressing against her back. Then Reverend Collins approached the pulpit, his weathered face creasing in the smile that had comforted Redstone Ridge through mining disasters, droughts, and personal tragedies for 15 years. Easter morning, he began, his voice carrying to the farthest corner of the packed church, reminds us that what appears to be an ending may instead be a beginning. What seems impossible to mortal eyes, resurrection, redemption, renewal, becomes possible through divine grace. Kendra felt Bradley shift beside her, his attention captured by the preacher's words. She wondered if he too was thinking of their unlikely connection, of the barriers that should have kept them firmly in their separate worlds. The stone that sealed the tomb, Reverend Collins continued, appeared immovable to human strength, yet it was rolled away, revealing not death but new life. His gaze swept the congregation, seeming to linger briefly on the Morgan pew. How many stones do we place in our own paths? Stones of prejudice, of rigid thinking, of hearts hardened against possibilities that challenge our comfortable assumptions? Martha stirred restlessly, her prayer book rustling as she adjusted it with unnecessary precision. Josephine, by contrast, leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. Easter calls us to examine those stones, the preacher said, his voice gentling, to ask whether they protect us from genuine harm or merely prevent us from experiencing the renewal God intends for our lives. What tomb of dead hopes might be opened if we allowed the stone to be rolled away? The sermon continued, weaving scripture with practical application in the direct manner Bradley had mentioned. Yet throughout, Kendra found herself returning to the image of the stone, of barriers removed to reveal unexpected life. Her deception about her credentials, Bradley's reluctance to challenge his family's expectations, Martha's rigid notions of suitable matches, all stones that seemed immovable until someone found the courage to push against them. When the service concluded and the congregation rose for the final hymn, Bradley's hand found hers, hidden between the folds of their clothing. The simple touch, warm and sure, spoke volumes that neither could voice in this public setting. Whatever came of their growing connection, whether joy or heartbreak awaited beyond this day, something had already changed, irrevocably for them both. The recessional hymn ended, and the congregation began moving toward the doors, where Reverend Collins would greet each family. Bradley maintained his position at Kendra's side, neither hurrying ahead with his sisters nor allowing her to fall back as a servant might. "Bradley, darling," Cecilia inserted herself between them as they reached the vestibule, her gloved hand claiming his arm with practiced ease. "Mrs. Winchester has just arrived with her husband. You simply must greet them before they leave. Henry mentioned at dinner last night how eager he is to discuss the processing method with you before tomorrow's meeting. The deliberate separation might have succeeded if Josephine hadn't stepped smoothly to Kendra's side, linking their arms as if they were longtime friends rather than mistress and cook. Miss Tompkins was just telling me about the Easter sweetbreads her mother used to make. I'm absolutely determined to learn the recipe." She raised her voice slightly, ensuring it carried to nearby congregants. Bradley has been singing the praises of Miss Tompkins' cooking to everyone who listen. We're quite fortunate to have secured her services before some Denver household discovered her talents. The public endorsement from a Morgan daughter sent a ripple of reassessment through the watching crowd. Kendra caught several women exchanging glances that suggested they might be reevaluating their initial judgments. "Indeed," Bradley confirmed, extricating himself from Cecilia with firm politeness and returning to Kendra's side. "Miss Tompkins has brought unexpected blessings to our household." The warmth in his voice transformed the simple statement into something more significant, a declaration that even the most obtuse observer could not misinterpret. As they moved toward the church steps where Reverend Collins was greeting parishioners, Kendra became aware of Cecilia falling back to speak urgently with an elegantly dressed older woman who had been pointed out to her as Mrs. Winchester, wife of Bradley's principal investor. Though she couldn't hear their words, the occasional glances cast in her direction suggested the topic of conversation. "She's poisoning the well," Josephine murmured, following Kendra's gaze. Cecilia excels at character assassination, delivered as concerned friendship. "What could she possibly know about me?" Kendra whispered back, anxiety fluttering in her chest. Josephine's expression grew troubled. "Martha has been making inquiries. Something about the whistling kettle? And your claimed experience in Santa Fe?" The blood drained from Kendra's face so rapidly that she feared she might faint. Before she could respond, they reached Reverend Collins, whose weathered hand clasped hers with genuine warmth. "Miss Tompkins, your father is much missed in our congregation. He would be proud to see you here today." "Thank you, Reverend," Kendra managed, touched by the simple kindness. "A fine sermon, Collins," Bradley said, shaking the preacher's hand. "Your words about removing stones that block our path seemed particularly timely. The Lord provides the message needed." Collins replied with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I merely deliver it, often without fully understanding its purpose." His gaze moved between Bradley and Kendra with quiet perception, though sometimes I glimpse its impact more clearly than others. As they descended the church steps toward the waiting carriage, Bradley kept Kendra firmly at his side, despite Cecilia's attempts to engage him in conversation with the Winchesters. The gesture, small but unmistakable, was noticed by everyone gathered on the church lawn. "He's made his choice clear," Josephine commented under her breath as they waited for the carriage to be brought around. "Martha won't forgive that easily, nor will Cecilia." I never sought this attention, Kendra replied, discomfort rising as she noted the stares and whispers surrounding them. I only wanted to earn enough to save our... She stopped abruptly, realizing she'd nearly revealed more than intended. Josephine's quick glance suggested she'd caught the slip, but before she could question it, Martha approached, her expression composed, though her eyes glittered with controlled fury. Bradley, the Winchesters have invited us to join them for luncheon at the hotel. Naturally, you'll want to discuss business before tomorrow's meeting in Denver. It was a masterful move, Kendra had to admit. Bradley could hardly refuse such an invitation from his primary investor without raising questions he wouldn't want to address before the Easter ball. Bradley hesitated, clearly torn between social obligation and his desire to remain at Kendra's side. Miss Tompkins was planning to... I'm certain Miss Tompkins has Easter preparations requiring her attention at home, Martha interrupted smoothly. The ball arrangements alone must be quite demanding. Before Bradley could protest, Kendra touched his arm lightly. Your sister is right. There's much to do before this evening. She forced a smile, determined not to show how deeply Martha's dismissal had stung. You should accept the Winchesters' invitation. The meeting tomorrow is important. Bradley's expression darkened, but he recognized the impossible position. Very well. Harrison can take you home in the carriage, and I'll ride back with the Winchesters after luncheon. How practical, Cecilia commented, sidling closer to thread her arm through Bradley's. Miss Tompkins is so refreshingly aware of her priorities. The subtle emphasis on the last word made its double meaning clear, a reminder of Kendra's status as a servant, not a social equal. As the Morgan sisters moved toward the Winchesters' waiting carriage, with Bradley reluctantly between them, Kendra caught a final exchange between Cecilia and Martha, their heads bent close together in conspiratorial intimacy. The blue gown in Josephine's wardrobe, Martha was saying. She thinks we don't know. Leave it to me, Cecilia replied, her smile a study in malicious anticipation. By the time I'm finished, she won't dare show her face at the ball. A chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze settled in Kendra's bones as Harrison helped her into the Morgan carriage. Whatever game Martha and Cecilia were playing, the Easter ball had become their battlefield, and Kendra herself the prize they were determined Bradley would not claim. The afternoon sun slanted through Josephine's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the lilac gown laid carefully across the bed. Kendra studied her reflection in the cheval mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. Josephine's clever fingers had arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style, with soft curls framing her face and the rest swept up with pearl-tipped pins borrowed from Josephine's own collection. You look beautiful, Josephine declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Bradley won't be able to take his eyes off you. If I don't disgrace myself by tripping over the gown or using the wrong fork, Kendra fretted, smoothing nervous hands over the silk skirt. I've never attended anything grander than a town social. Just follow my lead, Josephine assured her. And remember, half the people there will be too busy gossiping about you and Bradley to notice which fork you use. Her impish smile took the sting from the observation. Besides, Bradley wouldn't care if you ate with your fingers. He's quite smitten. Heat crept into Kendra's cheeks at the frank assessment. Josephine, truly, you mustn't encourage such notions. Whatever your brother's interest, there are realities that cannot be ignored. Such as the fact that I'm a cook in his household, that my father was a miner turned restaurateur, not a banker or businessman, that I have no dowry, no connections, nothing to recommend me as a suitable match for Bradley Morgan. Josephine's expression softened. You underestimate my brother's independence and his affection for you. Bradley has never cared for society's opinion, as Martha and I were raised to do. Father's death and Eleanor's betrayal only strengthened his determination to live by his own standards. The mention of Eleanor brought Cecilia's churchyard whispers to mind. Kendra hesitated, then voiced the question that had troubled her since that morning. At church, you mentioned Martha making inquiries about the whistling kettle. What exactly has she discovered? A flicker of concern crossed Josephine's face. Only that it's a small eatery in town owned by the Tompkins family. Your family, I presume, and that contrary to what Bradley believes, you've never cooked professionally in Santa Fe. Kendra sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The deception seemed small when I applied for the position. The Whistling Kettle was facing closure, and I needed the wages Bradley offered to save it. I never imagined. She gestured helplessly at the ball gown, at the elegant bedroom, at all that had developed from that initial lie. Rather than the condemnation Kendra expected, Josephine sat beside her with a sympathetic smile. We all present the version of ourselves we think others want to see. You embellished your experience to secure a position you were qualified for in every way that matters. Martha manipulates everyone around her while claiming it's for their own good. Even Bradley presents himself as more certain and detached than he truly is. The difference is that my deception could hurt Bradley if it becomes public, Kendra said quietly. His investors already question his judgment regarding the new processing method. How would they react to learning he employed a cook with fabricated credentials? You underestimate Bradley again, Josephine replied. He values results over credentials. Your cooking has been exemplary. Your management of the household during our visit faultless. That matters more to my brother than where you learned your skills. Before Kendra could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. Josephine frowned, rising to answer it. Mrs. Winters knows we're not to be disturbed until... She opened the door to reveal Harrison, his usually impassive face troubled. Miss Josephine, your presence is required immediately in the library. Miss Martha insists it cannot wait. Now? But we're in the middle of preparations for the ball. She was most insistent, miss. Something about a telegram from Boston regarding Mr. Edward. Josephine's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. Very well. Tell her I'll be down directly. As Harrison departed, she turned back to Kendra. Edward is Martha's husband. If there's news from Boston, it must be significant. Will you be all right finishing your preparations alone? Of course, Kendra assured her. The gown merely needs fastening. Go to your sister. After Josephine hurried away, Kendra turned back to the mirror, studying her transformed appearance. The gown's color highlighted the warm tones in her skin and brought out golden flecks in her brown eyes that she'd never noticed before. With her hair arranged so elegantly and wearing Josephine's borrowed pearl earrings, she looked like a different woman entirely. Someone who might, just might, be worthy of standing beside Bradley Morgan at the Easter ball. A sound from the hallway, the soft click of a door opening and closing, drew her attention. Assuming Josephine had returned, Kendra moved toward the door, calling out, "That was quick. Did Martha merely want to..." She pulled up short as the door swung open to reveal not Josephine, but Cecilia, a predatory smile curving her perfect lips. "Miss Tompkins, how fortunate to find you alone. I had hoped for a private word before this evening's festivities." Alarm bells rang in Kendra's mind as Cecilia swept into the room, her gaze taking in the ball gown laid across the bed and Kendra's half-completed toilette with calculating assessment. My, how Josephine has transformed you. Almost unrecognizable as the cook who serves our breakfast each morning. Miss Winthrop, Kendra acknowledged stiffly, backing away until her legs met the edge of the dressing table. If you're looking for Josephine, she's been called to the library. A telegram from Boston. Yes, I know. Martha arranged it. Cecilia's smile widened at Kendra's startled expression. A simple ruse to ensure we wouldn't be interrupted. You see, I wanted to offer you some friendly advice before the ball. Indeed? Kendra fought to keep her voice steady, her mind racing as she recognized the trap closing around her. It's really quite simple. Cecilia moved to the bed, trailing her fingers along the silk of the lilac gown with deceptive gentleness. Bradley Morgan is not for you. Oh, he's enthralled at the moment. Your novelty, your pretense of simple frontier virtue, the contrast you present to women of his class. But novelty fades, Miss Tompkins, and when it does, Bradley will remember who he is and what he requires in a wife. I've made no claims on Mr. Morgan's future, Kendra replied, her father's stubborn pride stiffening her spine. Nor have I pretended to be anything other than what I am. Haven't you? Cecilia's laugh held no humor. Martha has made quite thorough inquiries. The Whistling Kettle. Your family's modest establishment, currently closed due to financial difficulties, Your invention of experience in Santa Fe to secure this position, your desperate need for funds to save your little restaurant. She infused the word with such contempt that it became an insult. Hardly the honest simplicity Bradley believes he's found in you. The direct confirmation of her fears left Kendra momentarily speechless. Martha had indeed uncovered everything, and she and Cecilia intended to use it. "What do you want?" Kendra asked finally, determined not to show fear before this predatory woman. "I want you to develop a sudden illness. A headache, perhaps, or a feminine complaint that prevents your attendance at the ball." Cecilia's voice hardened. "Bradley will escort me instead, as Martha originally arranged, and by the time you recover, the Easter holiday will be over and you'll return to your proper place in the kitchen. If, indeed, Bradley chooses to retain your services once he learns of your deception." "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll be forced to share what we've learned with Bradley before the ball. Imagine his humiliation before all of Redstone Ridge when he discovers his special friend has been lying to him from the beginning." Cecilia moved closer, her voice dropping to a silky threat. "Men forgive many things, Miss Tompkins, but not public humiliation." Before Kendra could respond, Cecilia reached out and grasped the delicate silk of the ball gown, her intentions unmistakable. "Such a lovely color. It would be a shame if something were to happen to it." "Don't," Kendra began, lunging forward, but it was too late. With deliberate malice, Cecilia twisted the fabric, her other hand producing a small pair of sewing scissors from her pocket. A quick, vicious slash opened a jagged tear across the bodice, destroying any possibility of repair before the ball. A second cut followed, this one along the skirt's left side, before Kendra could reach her. "How clumsy of me," Cecilia said with mock dismay. "It seems your gown has met with an unfortunate accident." "What a pity. No time to find a replacement before the ball begins." White-hot fury surged through Kendra's veins, temporarily overwhelming her shock. "How dare you? This isn't Josephine's gown to lend. It was a gift to me from Bradley." The lie sprang to her lips without premeditation, a desperate attempt to rebalance the power between them. Celia faltered, uncertainty flickering across her perfect features. "You're lying," she said, though with less conviction than before. "Bradley would never." "Ask him yourself," Kendra challenged, pressing her momentary advantage. "Ask him why he commissioned this gown specially from Denver, why he arranged for Mrs. Winters to take my measurements secretly, why he insisted on this particular shade of lilac." Doubt crept into Cecilia's expression. "Martha said Josephine." "Martha assumed, as she assumes many things." Kendra stepped forward, reclaiming the damaged gown from Cecilia's suddenly slack grip. "You've not only destroyed my gown, but Bradley's gift. How do you imagine he'll react to that?" For a moment, genuine fear crossed Cecilia's face. Then her natural arrogance reasserted itself. "He'll never believe you over me. Not when I explain about your deception, your financial desperation, your pathetic attempts to rise above your station." "What's happening here?" Josephine's voice cracked like a whip from the doorway. She stood frozen in shock, taking in the ruined gown in Kendra's hands and Cecilia's scissors still clutched guiltily at her side. "Cecilia, what have you done?" "What needed doing?" Cecilia replied, recovering her composure with impressive speed. "Better a damaged gown than Bradley's reputation. Martha agrees that this farce has gone far enough." Josephine crossed the room in swift strides, examining the gown with growing horror. "You malicious, contemptible—" She broke off, too angry to find adequate words. "Does Martha know exactly what you planned?" "It was her idea to ensure Miss Tompkins couldn't attend," Cecilia admitted with a careless shrug, "though the method was left to my discretion." "Get out," Josephine ordered, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Get out, before I forget every lesson in ladylike behavior I've ever learned." Cecilia hesitated, clearly weighing whether to press her advantage further. Something in Josephine's expression must have warned her against it, for she moved toward the door with a final poisonous smile at Kendra. "It doesn't matter," she said from the threshold. "Even if you somehow repair the gown, Martha intends to inform Bradley of Miss Tompkins's deception before the first dance. The whistling kettle, the fabricated credentials, all of it. Enjoy your brief moment in society, Miss Tompkins. It won't last beyond midnight." When the door closed behind her, Josephine sank onto the bed, cradling the damaged gown in her lap. That despicable, scheming. She looked up at Kendra, genuine anguish in her expression. I'm so sorry. I should have known Martha would try something like this. The telegram was obviously a ruse. It's not your fault, Kendra said numbly, the full impact of what had just occurred washing over her in waves. Not just the ruined gown, but the certainty that Martha and Cecilia intended to expose her deception publicly, ensuring maximum humiliation for both her and Bradley. The gown can be repaired, Josephine declared, examining the cuts with practical assessment. Not perfectly, but well enough to pass inspection in the ballroom's lighting. We have less than 2 hours, but between us we can manage it. What's the point? Kendra asked, sinking onto the dressing table stool. You heard Cecilia. Martha plans to tell Bradley everything before the first dance. My deception about the whistling kettle, my exaggerated credentials, all of it. Josephine's expression hardened with determination. Not if I reach him first. What? Bradley deserves to hear the truth from you, not as a weapon wielded by Martha. Josephine rose, moving purposefully to the bell pull. I'll summon Mrs. Winters. Between us, we'll mend the gown while you prepare what you'll say to Bradley. But the ball begins in less than 2 hours, Kendra protested. There's no time for explanations, for making him understand why I— Then you'll dance first and explain after, Josephine interrupted firmly. But you will attend the ball, Kendra Tompkins. You will not allow Martha and Cecilia to steal this night from you. Or from Bradley. The quiet determination in Josephine's voice steadied Kendra's nerves. She drew a deep breath, finding her center in the familiar way she had whenever crisis struck at the whistling kettle. A customer's complaint, a shortage of supplies, her father's sudden rages when silver prices fell. You're right, she said finally. I owe Bradley the truth, told my way, not theirs. But Josephine, she hesitated, then voiced her deepest fear. What if he cannot forgive the deception? What if they're right, and I'm merely a temporary distraction from his real life? Josephine moved to take Kendra's hands in hers, her expression softening into compassion. When Eleanor left Bradley, I was still young enough to believe in fairy tale romances. I couldn't understand how she could abandon someone who loved her so deeply. Martha said Eleanor left because she wasn't good enough for the Morgan name, Kendra recalled from her overheard conversation. That Martha convinced her she would eventually hold Bradley back. Is that what she told you? Josephine's face darkened with fresh anger, another of Martha's self-serving lies. Eleanor left because Martha convinced her that Bradley would be happier with someone from their social circle, someone who could advance his interests in Boston society. She manipulated Eleanor's genuine love for Bradley, twisting it into a sacrifice for his own good. Martha admitted this to you? Kendra asked, stunned by the depths of such manipulation. Not in so many words, no. But I found Eleanor crying in the garden the night before she returned Bradley's ring. She let slip enough for me to piece together Martha's role in her decision. Josephine's expression turned haunted. I was too young, too intimidated by Martha to speak up then. I've regretted my silence ever since, watching Bradley retreat into himself, building walls around his heart. Until now, Kendra whispered, understanding dawning. That's why you've helped me, despite the differences in our stations. Because you've done what I thought impossible. You've brought my brother back to life. Josephine squeezed Kendra's hands. The way he looks at you, it's how he used to look at the world before disappointment taught him caution. Open, hopeful, fully present in the moment instead of calculating risks and returns. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Winters' arrival, summoned by Josephine's earlier pull of the bell. The housekeeper's eyes widened at the sight of the damaged gown, but to her credit, she asked no questions as Josephine explained the need for immediate repairs. Fetch my sewing box and a pot of strong tea, the housekeeper instructed the maid who had accompanied her, and bring the blue thread from the third drawer in my desk. It's the closest match to this shade. As the women set to work on the damaged gown, Kendra moved to the window, staring out at the late afternoon shadows lengthening across the Morgan estate. Below, she could see Bradley returning from his ride, his tall figure dismounting with the easy grace that still made her heart skip when she watched him, unobserved. Tonight would change everything between them, for better or worse. Whether through Martha's malicious revelations or Kendra's own confession, Bradley would learn the truth before the ball ended. The only question was whether what had grown between them was strong enough to withstand the revelation of her deception, and whether, in the spirit of Easter's promise of renewal that Reverend Collins had spoken of that morning, something new and better might rise from the ruins of pretense finally swept away. That's the end of part 1. If you're ready for more drama, romance, and shifter magic, part 2 is waiting for you. Find the link in the comments or description below. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next part.